Over the next 3 hours, I'll teach you everything you need to know about HTML and CSS to build beautiful and responsive websites like the ones you're seeing right now. Today, we'll learn what HTML is and how to set it up as fast as possible. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a standard language that basically builds the structure of every website in the internet. You use HTML to define headings, paragraphs, links, images, and so on. So basically everything you see on a website. To write HTML, all you need is a text editor and a browser. You could basically write HTML code in a regular text editor, but since that is not very efficient, I recommend a code editor which highlights, formats, and indicates errors in the code for you. I recommend installing Visual Studio Code, and in order to do so, we are just going to type Visual Studio Code in Google, and then we click on the first link, and right here you can basically just click Download for Windows, which will get you to the download windows. Then you're going to wait until you install the entire setup, and once the installation is ready, you're basically going to click on the installer. Then you basically just accept the agreement, you click next, next, install, and then you wait until the installation is basically done. And once we're done, we're just going to press finish. Now we can open Visual Studio Code by typing Visual Studio Code into our search bar, for example, or you can obviously just click the shortcut on your desktop. And this will open Visual Studio Code. We can maximize it here. And now we can basically go to the desired destination by pressing File, Open Folder. Now we can, for example, navigate to the desktop. And here we can create a new folder, for example, which can have the name HTML, or the name is basically up to you. And we're going to select that folder. And as you can see, we are now inside of our folder. To create an HTML file, we can now press on the new file icon and give our file a name like index.html. The .html ending tells the browser that this file is an HTML file, and this is really important if you want to create your websites. It's a convention that you basically always name your root file, so the entry of your website, index.html. We're now going to install two extensions that are really important if you want to work with HTML. The first one is basically called Prettier, which is a code formatter. To install extensions, you are first going to navigate to the extensions tab over here. And right here in the search bar, you can type the name of the extension, which is Prettier in our case. Then we're going to press on Prettier code formatter right here. And we're going to press install. The second extension we're going to get is the live server. Again, we're going to navigate to the live server extension and we're going to press install. Now there's one additional thing we need to do to set up Prettier, so basically our code formatter. We're going to press on File, Preferences, and right here we're going to navigate to Settings, and right here we're going to type in the search bar, we're going to type Format. And right here we can select a default formatter, and it's really important that you select Prettier from the drop-down menu. So we are going to select Prettier code formatter. And the second thing we are going to do is enable format on save. And by enabling this, the code editor will make sure that the file is formatted properly every time we basically save. And you'll see what is going on here in a second. To generate a basic template in our index.html file, we are now going to use an exclamation mark and basically press enter. And this is what the basic HTML template looks like. And now if we press Ctrl S, which basically saves our file, you can see that Prettier formatted our document. To run our website, we are now going to right-click our index.html file and press Open with Live Server. This may take a second, but now you can see we basically opened our file on a website. You could also open your website without the live server by navigating into the folder where you saved your file and double-clicking your index file, for example. We'll open it up in the browser, and you can see we also have our index.html file right here. But the difference between opening the index file manually and opening it with the live server is that the live server will make sure that every time you save your file, all of the changes will be displayed live on the website, which obviously makes development a lot easier since you don't have to reopen your website every time you make a single change. So now you know what HTML is, what it is used for, and how to set up your first project. Today we'll learn the structure of an HTML file. Every HTML file follows the same basic skeleton, and here it is. Doc type HTML tells the browser this is an HTML file. HTML wraps the entire page. Inside head, you put metadata like title, styles, and scripts. Metadata is basically the information about the page that isn't shown directly, like the title, the description, or the character set, for example. Inside the body, you put the visible content of the page. Text, images, links, so basically everything the viewer sees in the end. Think of it like this. The head includes all of the information, while the body is what you actually see. So that's the basic structure of every HTML file. Today we learn what the head in HTML is. The head is a place where you put information about your page that isn't directly shown to the user. This includes the title, the character set, and instructions for the browser. Here are the most important tags that you use in almost every website. The title tag sets the text in the browser tab. Meta name viewport makes the page responsive for mobile. So this is basically important to make the website look good on pretty much all devices. Meta charset UTF-8 tells the browser to use UTF-8 character encoding, which supports most languages and symbols. Computers only work with numbers, specifically with zeros and ones. A character set is needed to translate those numbers into letters and those letters into numbers, symbols, or emojis. UTF-8 is the standard today because it supports almost every language and almost every character. Those were the tags you basically need on every single website. So let's take a look at some important ones you will use pretty often. The link tag is used to connect your CSS files to your HTML file. Meta name description is important to create a description for your website and is basically the description that shows up in the Google search results. Meta name author defines the author of the page. The script tag is used to load your JavaScript files after HTML is parsed. So let's take a look at the head inside of Visual Studio Code. First of all, we can create a basic template again by using the exclamation mark and pressing enter. We're going to open the website with the live server again. And at the moment, if you take a look at the top right here, you can see that we have the text document over here. By changing the title, for example, to test title and pressing save, we can change the title on our website. And as you can see, right on the top here, we have test title now. We also have the meta tag that basically defines the char set, and we have the meta tag that defines the viewport and makes our website responsive, so that it basically looks good on mobile and pretty much every device you use. If we type meta followed by a colon, we can see the different meta tags we can use. And for example, you have UTF-8 right here. So if we just press enter, we are basically gonna generate a basic UTF-8 meta tag. We can also use meta colon description, which is basically a tag used to create a description for a website. So we can just create a basic description here by, for example, typing this is a basic description for our website, like this. We could, for example, link a style sheet by using the link tag followed by a colon and CSS, basically selecting that one from the drop-down menu, and now we collected a style sheet with the name style.css. Since we don't have the style sheet at the moment, this is not going to work. But if you want to link a CSS file to your HTML page, this would be the way to do it. And you don't have to understand what CSS is at the moment, but this is really an important concept when you really work with HTML and CSS. If you want to add an author, we can basically use the meta tag again, give it the name equals author, and then we can add the content attribute and say that the author equals Pascal, for example. Then we close the tag, and by doing so, we basically added an author to our website. You can also use the script tag to link a JavaScript file to your HTML page. You don't really need to know what JavaScript is at the moment, but just keep in mind that this is really an important concept, and you usually use a lot of JavaScript with HTML when creating a web page. To link a JavaScript file, you can basically type script :source, and by pressing enter, you'll basically have the basic template. Now you can basically define a source that could, for example, be an app.js file. We don't have this file at the moment, but we could create one by typing app.js here, for example. And now we link this app.js file to our index.html file. If we define the script tag in the head, it's important to add the deffer attribute. Those were the most important things you need to know about the head in HTML. What is the body in HTML? The body is the part of an HTML page that actually shows up in the browser. Every visible element, text, images, links, buttons, forms, and so on goes inside of the body. Let's take a look at the basic structure of a body inside of HTML. If I type something inside of the body, it will show up on the web page. If we type in hello guys, for example, and save the web page, you can see it. It's displaying right here on the page. Obviously, you can display all types of elements on our website. Headings work, for example. Paragraphs work as well. Of course, you can also add links that navigate you to a different website or an image. Obviously, you don't need to know all of these tags yet, but this is basically how the body works inside of HTML. Today, we learn what HTML tags are. HTML is made of tags. A tag tells the browser what kind of element something is, like text, a heading, an image, or a link. Most tags come in pairs, an opening tag and a closing tag. The opening tag looks like this, while the closing tag looks like this. Everything in between is the content. Some tags are self-closing, which means that you close the tag within itself. This is indicated by a backslash at the end of the opening tag. If an element needs content like text inside, it's usually not self-closing. If the element just stands alone, like defining the char set for example, it's usually self-closing. Hope you understand tags now. Today, we learn what attributes are in HTML. Attributes give extra information about an element. They always go inside the opening tag. Let's take a look at an example. Right here, source tells the browser where the image file is, for example. Alt gives an alternative text if the image can't be loaded. Rule of thumb, tags define what an element is. Attributes define details about it. And this is what attributes in HTML are. Today, we'll learn headings and tags in HTML. Headings go from H1 to H6, and they define titles or subtitles on a page. Let's take a look at it in VS Code. By using an opening tag for the H1 tag and a closing tag for the H1 tag, and writing something in between, we generate a title. And the title could, for example, be all you need to know about cameras. And once we save, we see we have an H1 title on the top of our page. Usually every website should only have one single H1 title, which basically represents the title of the entire page. You could also add an H2, which is basically a subtitle on your page. Let's add an H2 with the text my favorite cameras. And once we save it, you can see the H2 popping up right below our H1. As you can see, the H2 is slightly smaller than the H1, and you can have as many H2 tags as you want. We could add a second H2 right here, for example, saying the most expensive cameras. If we further want to divide the H2, we can use the H3 to create several subtitles for the H2 subtitle. We could, for example, say that the first subtitle is the Sony A7300. Then we save it and you see we have a third subtitle, which basically is right below my favorite cameras. Now we might have several cameras, so we can duplicate the subtitle by pressing Shift, Alt and the down arrow. And by doing so, we can, for example, duplicate it twice. Now we could maybe add the Fujifilm X-T3 and probably the Sony camcorder. And now we have three subtitles showing three different cameras. We could obviously further divide our page into H4. This is an H4. And we could further divide our H4s into H5s, of course. And finally, we could add an H6 to further divide our H5s into H6. This is an H6. You don't really use H1 to H6 for styling purposes, but to really tell the Google search engine how your website is basically structured. So your H1 should always be the title of your website and the most important, most descriptive thing to describe your website. Your H2 is then usually used to subdivide your website into subsections. H3 is used to subdivide your H2s into further subsections, the way I did it right here. And then H4, H5 and H6 obviously further to subdivide the previous title. Paragraphs, on the other hand, are written within the P tag and they're used to display blocks of text on the page. So headings basically give structure, paragraphs give content. So if we take a look at our page inside of Visual Studio Code, we would, for example, write a short paragraph about every single camera. So basically about the Sony A7300, the Fujifilm X-T3 and the Sony camcorder. So we can basically generate a paragraph by using a P tag, an opening and a closing P tag. And inside of these P tags, we basically have the text we want to display. So this could be a basic text like this, or we could also obviously use a longer text. We can create a placeholder text, for example, right here, just for demonstration. by writing lorem and then the amount of words we want to use as a placeholder text. In our case, we want to use 30 words, for example. So we'd write lorem 30, we'll press enter, and it will generate 30 words, as you can see. And now we have our paragraph below the Sony heading. Obviously, we can use multiple paragraphs on our website. So we could, for example, add a paragraph below the Fujifilm X-T3. We could add a paragraph below the Sony camcorder and so on. And by doing so, we have headings and paragraphs right now to give our website structure and content. Today, we learn all about lists in HTML. There are two main types of lists, ordered lists and unordered lists. An unordered list uses the UL tag. Each item inside of an unordered list goes inside of an LI tag. An ordered list uses the OL tag and numbers the items automatically. Here, items also go inside of an LI tag. If you need a specific order, like step 1, step 2, use an ordered list. If the order doesn't matter, like a list of ingredients, use an unordered list. So let's take a look at that inside of Visual Studio Code. First of all, we are going to start by creating an unordered list. We can do so by using the UL tag, by basically using an opening and a closing tag for the unordered list. Now we will use the LI tag to create different list items. So we can basically do so by using the LI tag, and inside of the LI tag we are basically going to use some text like this is the first item. Now we can duplicate this item 2 times, for example, and create a second item and a third item. Once we save, we can basically see those bullet points, and we have our first item, we have our second item, and we have our third item. And as you can see, you could basically add as many items as you want to. Now let's take a look at the ordered list by using an OL tag for ordered list, and again using LI to create different list items again. This could, for example, be the first ordered list item, and now we'll save our website, and as you can see, we have a 1 right here, and now it basically says this is the first ordered list item. Now we can duplicate this item again, and as you see, it now basically enumerates every single item. So you have a first item, you have a second bullet point, and a third bullet point. And we could, for example, rename this to second and third, but it doesn't really matter too much. I'm sure you basically understand the difference between ordered and unordered lists now. Every time the order of the list matters, you basically use an OL tag, and otherwise you use an UL tag. This is basically all you need to know about ordered lists and unordered lists. Today we learn what links in HTML are. Links are created within the A tag, which stands for anchor. So let's take a look at it inside of Visual Studio Code. We can create a link by using the A tag and pressing enter. As you can see, it automatically creates this href tag, which basically defines the location we are going to get once we click the link. So we could, for example, go to google.com, for example. We can copy this link and paste this link into this href tag. As you can see, it takes the full link. If we go back to our website, you basically can't see anything. So we basically need something to press on our link. So we'll add a text right here, which could basically say go to Google. Now we save our website, and now we have this link here which says go to Google. If you click this link right now, we will be redirected to Google, as you can see, but we basically want to go back. And now imagine you want to open this link in a new tab once clicking on it. And you can do so by using the target attribute, as you can see, which is equal to underline blank. And by adding target equals underline blank, you will redirect the user inside of another tab basically. So once we click on to go to Google right now, it will open a new tab, as you can see right here, and then it will redirect the user inside of the new tab to Google. And as you can see, our website is still open right now. And if we click 3 times on this link, for example, it will open 3 different tabs. If you want to navigate the user to another HTML tag, you could create a second HTML page here, for example, which could, for example, be our contact page. So we are going to name it contact.html. Now we're going to generate a basic template on this page as well. And we're just going to say contact right here, for example. And now we could, for example, generate a second anchor tag. And inside of this anchor tag, we are going to say go to contact page. We're going to save, but as you can see, if we click this link now, it basically doesn't do anything because we didn't use an href here. To navigate to another HTML page inside of the same folder, we can use the hashtag, and then we are basically just going to type the name of the page, which is contact.html. And if we want to navigate to the contact.html, we basically just have to type the name of the page, which is inside of the same folder right here, and press enter. And now by clicking on go to contact page, we will open the contact page, as you can see. And now we landed on the contact page. Obviously, we could also add the target equals underline blank attribute as well here. And if we click go to contact page, we will open a new tab now, and we will open the contact page inside of a new tab. So this is all you need to know about the anchor tag in HTML. Today we learn about images in HTML. Images are added within the image tag. It's a self-closing tag, which means it doesn't need a closing partner. So let's take a look at it inside of VS Code. First of all, we can create an image by using the image tag. The image tag looks like this, and it has two attributes, the source attribute and the alt attribute. The source attribute is basically used to define the location of the image, while the alt attribute is used to create a fallback text in case the image can't be loaded. And it is also used for search engines to understand your content, and in case you have visually impaired users, the screen reader will basically read out the alt text. So the alt text is pretty important as well. Now let's get an image to use on our website. We can, for example, use Unsplash or download it pretty much anywhere online. We could, for example, display this image. Then we are going to press download for free. We are going to take the image once it has been downloaded, and we're going to drag it right into our folder in VS Code. So we're basically going to go here, we're going to drag it into our folder. The name is kind of weird right now, so we're going to rename the image to my image, for example. The name doesn't really matter though. And now we can basically use the source attribute to define the path to our image. And right now, the image is basically in the same folder, so we're just going to enter or just going to write the name inside of the source attribute by defining my-image.jpg. And now if we save our website, it should basically already display our image. Obviously the image is way too big, but we could change it, for example, by using the width attribute and, for example, putting this to, for example, 100 pixels or 500 pixels or whatever. But usually it's obviously not recommended to use HTML attributes for styling, and you usually use CSS for this. I just wanted to show you that this is basically the image and that you can also use the width attribute to basically rescale the image, but this is not the recommended way. And as I already mentioned, it's also important to use an alt text, so we could basically say that we have some glasses on a chair. And now, in case the image can't be loaded, we will basically have this fallback text, or if a screen reader would read out our website, it would basically read out this alt text. So this is basically all you need to know about images in HTML. Today we learn about divs and spans in HTML. Not every element in HTML has a meaning. Some are just containers. For example, div is a block level container and span is an inline container. They basically don't describe what's inside, they just group elements. Think of a classroom. The pupils inside are the elements, they're the actual content. The classroom itself is just a container grouping all those pupils together and separating one class from another. That's what a container like a div does in HTML. It doesn't have meaning by itself, but it groups elements so it can organize or style them as one unit. You can create a div by typing div, then closing a bracket, and you have an opening and a closing tag for a div. And everything inside of this div basically belongs to this div container. We can now, for example, write something inside of the div, like here is some text, and you'll see the text on the website. But this text is inside of a div right now. And we can take a look at this div inside of the inspector, which we can basically open by right-clicking the page and inspect. And those are basically developer tools. So if you basically hover over the body, it highlights basically everything that belongs to the body element. Now you can expand the body and see what is basically inside of the body. And as you can see, we have our div inside of the body right here. And now if we make our website a little bit bigger and we hover over the body, we see that basically the div is our body, so this is the entire body. Now if we hover over the div, it basically highlights the entire div, and as you can see, our div goes from left to right. So it basically takes up the entire available space, so everything from left to right. Now I want to show you a second container element, which is basically the span, and we're going to create it pretty similar to the div. The only difference is basically that the name is span. Now we can also like write something inside of the span, like here is some span text. And now we save our website and this basically reloads our website. So now if we hover over the body, it basically marks everything. So it marks our div and our span. And the reason for this is that our div and our span are basically child elements of our body. So our div and our span are inside of our body. Now we can expand our body. And if we hover over our div, it basically marks our div. And if we hover over our span, it marks our span. As you can see, our div takes up all the available space from left to right. If you see it right here, everything that is blue is basically our div. If we hover over our span, you can basically see that our span takes up the minimal available space. So it just takes up the space that is necessary to display the text. So we could, for example, create a second div element right here and say, here is a second div, and we'll save our website. And as you can see, it will display our second div below our first div. And the reason for this is that our first div takes up all the available space. We create a second div, and the second div takes up all the available space. So it obviously needs to display the second div inside of a new row because there's no space available in the first row. But if we create a second span, for example, by using the span tag again and saying here is a second span, it can display the second span right next to the first span because the first span just takes up the minimal space necessary to display the text. So there's a lot of space available right next to the first span. And basically a div is called a block level element because it is basically displayed as a block that takes up all the available space. And span is basically called an inline element because you can basically display multiple spans in line, in one single line, because they take up the minimal necessary space to display the content inside. Both of them are basically containers, just with a different purpose. And that is all you need to know about divs and spans. Today we'll learn about HTML hierarchies. HTML is structured like a family tree. Elements can contain other elements. An element that wraps another one is the parent, and the one inside is the child. This parent-child relationship is what creates the structure of every web page. So let's take a look at it inside of VS Code. First of all, we have our HTML tag that basically wraps the entire web page. So this is basically the parent element of every element inside. Now we have the head and the body, which are both direct childs to our HTML tag. If we create a new element inside of our body, we create a child to the body element. So we can, for example, create a div inside of our body, and now this div is a child of this body tag, and this body tag is a child of this HTML tag again. If we, for example, create a paragraph inside of our div, which contains some text, for example, and we save our web page, then this paragraph is a child of this div. So this div is basically the parent of this paragraph, and this paragraph is the child of this div. This div again is the child of this body, and this body again is the child of this HTML tag. Now we can create a second paragraph, and now we have one child of this div, and we have another child of this div. And now we can take a look at this inside of the inspector by right-clicking and pressing inspect. And as you can see the structure, the tree structure of this HTML document. If we hover over the HTML tag, you can see that it marks basically everything that contains to this HTML tag. So basically everything. But if we hover over the body tag, it basically highlights almost everything again, because the body includes basically all of the information, because the body is basically a parent element to pretty much all of the content. If we hover over the div tag, again, it highlights both p tags, because both of these p tags are direct children of this div. And now if we hover over the paragraph, it basically highlights the first paragraph. If we hover over the second paragraph, it basically highlights the second paragraph. Under developer tools in the element section, you can really good visualize the tree structure of every HTML document. By pressing this arrow and opening the body, you basically see all of the children of the body element. By opening the div, you basically see all of the children of the div element, and so on. And understanding this structure is really important when working with HTML. Today we learn all you need to know about semantic HTML. Usually the basic template of a web page consists of a header, a main section, and a footer. The header usually contains the head content of your website, so basically navigation bar like the nav bar. And for example, if you take a look at a company website, you oftentimes have a video or an image on the top that basically shows what the company is doing, for example. And that usually belongs in the header as well. The main section usually contains the main content, so the main information that you want to share with the user. So that could be, if you think about a blog post, that could be the blog post, for example. And then finally you have a footer on pretty much every website that includes basic information like the contact us information, a phone number, a street, a city, and so on. So all of that basically goes into the footer. Now you can further subdivide these sections with certain elements, and I'm going to introduce you to those elements. The first element that is pretty important is the nav element, which, as the name already implies, basically is the nav bar or wraps the nav bar. Inside of this nav element, we could, for example, create a nav bar now by using an unordered list, then a list item, and now inside of this list item, we can create a link that, for example, points to our home page, which could be our index.html. So basically this page. Let's say that is our home page, and now we can copy this link tags and create two more nav elements, and let's say the second one goes to an about us page and the third link goes to a contact page. Obviously we didn't create those pages yet. We have a contact page, so we can create that one, but we don't have an about us page. But usually you could obviously add an about us page as well, and then this link would redirect to the about us page, and this link would redirect to the contact page. So this is basically a nav bar, and usually the nav bar goes inside of the header. Now when it comes to the main content, if you think about like a website that basically introduces the user to cameras, for example, you could use a section, and a section is used to group related content inside of the main area. So let's imagine we have a section right here, and inside of the section we have an H2, for example, that says my favorite cameras. So this section basically groups all of my favorite cameras. So we could actually also create a second section, and this second section could, for example, include the worst cameras. So now I have one group for my favorite cameras, and now I have another group for the worst cameras, in my opinion. And in this group, I could, for example, list all of my favorite cameras. So every camera should basically go inside of an article, because an article is a self-contained piece of content, like a blog post or a post about a camera, for example. A post about one single camera or information about one single camera goes inside of an article, because it is basically a short article about one single camera, and those articles all together make up one section, because all of those articles, all of those single cameras are part of my favorite cameras. Hope that was a good explanation. So I could go here and create an article tag to group one article, and right here I could use an H3 tag, for example, and say my first favorite cameras, maybe the Fujifilm X-T3, for example. Then I could like create a short paragraph including maybe 30 words, and now I have an article that includes my first favorite camera, which is the Fujifilm X-T3, and I have a little bit of text about it. So I could go here and take this article and create a second article inside of my section, because I obviously have more than one favorite camera. So I could also have the Sony camcorder as another camera that I really like. So now I have two cameras inside of my favorite camera section, and both of these cameras go inside of an article. Now I could obviously go here and take this article and paste this article into my section, second section as well. I could change maybe the names, so this could be the XT4, for example, and yeah, this could be whatever. It doesn't really matter. I hope you get the idea. And now you might also want to give the user the possibility to buy this camera on Amazon, for example. Maybe you're an affiliate and you want to make some money by redirecting the user to Amazon, whatsoever, it doesn't really matter. But the link does not really contain to the content, if you want to say, because the link is like not really any information that the user needs, and the information also does not really belong to the content. So it's more or less something that is aside from the content. So here you can use the aside tag, because this is like site information, like sidebar or related links, as you can see. So we can use the aside tag right here, and inside of this aside tag we can, for example, create a link, and this link redirects wherever, and in our case we say get the Fujifilm X-T3, for example. And now we have a link right here where we could click basically on, maybe get redirected to Amazon or wherever, and buy the Fujifilm X-T3. So this is basically the purpose of the aside tag. Now let's get to the footer, which is usually on the bottom of your web page and usually contains links to, for example, a contact form, or includes copyright information or a phone number whatsoever. So we could, for example, create a paragraph here, say add copyright 2K25, then we could add a phone number, say phone colon +49176, doesn't really matter, and so on. So we can like create content that basically usually goes in the footer, that does not really belong to the main content and does also not belong into the header. So basically just some site information that some people might need, but content that does not really belong to the main content and is not really necessary for the purpose of the page, to be honest. And this is the basic structure of every web page if you work with HTML. Let's learn about inputs in HTML. The first input I want to show you is the text input. You can create an input by using the input element, and then you can use the type attribute to define a certain type. And as you can see, we have a lot of different types right here. And to create a text input field, we basically select the text input type. And once we save, we basically have our input field right here, where we can type basic text. If you want to indicate what the input is used for, you can use a placeholder to show the user a certain text, like username, for example. And now once we save the website, we see that the user basically sees username right here. So this indicates to the user that this field is probably used to create a username. So I could, for example, create my username right here now. For a lot of inputs, you also want to use an ID field like username and a name field like username. Those two attributes are especially important when you work with JavaScript and CSS. Creating a password works pretty similar by creating an input field and using a type of password. As you can see, if we type something inside of the password field, it is now hidden. Again, we can use the placeholder field as well here, and those attributes work pretty much for most input fields. A tip if you work inside of Visual Studio Code is that you can basically type the name of the tag, which is input, followed by a colon, and then the type of the input field you want to use. Let's say we want to use an email input field. By using colon email and pressing enter, you basically auto-generate a basic template for an email field. Now you could enter a name, which could be email, and an ID, which could be email, for example. Once we save, we have an input field for our email, which could be heyo@gmail.com. To create an input field for a number, we can create an input field again with the type of number. And for the number input field, we can also define a min value, which could be 0, and a max value, which could be 100, for example. And as you can see, if we type like 90 inside of this input field and we are like going upwards, we can just go up to 100. And the same obviously goes in the opposite direction. To create a checkbox, we can again create an input field of type checkbox. And we can, for example, give the checkbox a name of is broke and an ID of is broke. And once we save, we basically have our checkbox right here, which we can check and uncheck. The checkbox also has a checked attribute, and once we save, you can see our checkbox is checked. And if we uncheck it and save our file, our checkbox is basically checked again. So this checked attribute basically makes sure that the website, once it loads, has a checkbox that is already checked. Radio buttons are pretty similar to a checkbox, but it's probably easier to understand if I just show it to you. Like this, we have a radio button, and we can, for example, create 3 different radio buttons right here, and we can check every single radio button. But if we use the same name for each radio button, like has pants, and now we just copy this name and paste it into all of the 3 radio buttons, we can check one radio button, we can try to check the second one, but as you can see, Once we check the first radio button, it unchecks the second radio button. So this name attribute basically allows you to connect different radio buttons and makes sure that you are just able to select one single radio button. And this is really good if you want to make sure that the user has to choose between different options, for example, and is just able to choose one single option. To create an input field that allows the user to select the date, we can use the date type. And once we save, we basically have this date picker where the user can open a date form, if you want to say it like that, and select a desired date, for example. You can also give the user the option to upload a file by using the file input field. And once you save the code and update your HTML file, you have the option to choose a file from here. And this gives you the option to upload an image, for example, or whatever. Usually when working with input fields, you use them inside of a form most of the time, and every form needs to have the option to submit the form to a server, for example. So if you think about Facebook, you type in your username, you type in your password, and then you press a button. And this button allows you to register, to log in, whatsoever. And this button is basically the submit button. So this button tells the browser to submit the form to a server. And to create this button, you can use an input field as well, because in the end, a button press is just an input that the user gives. And you can create that input field by using input:submit. And this will create an input field of type submit. And you can create a value, which could be register, for example. The value is just the text of the button. And if you click register, you would submit the form to a server if all of this was inside of a form, which it isn't right now, but usually you use this input field inside of a form to submit a form. And something that you use oftentimes in combination with the input fields is the label. And the label allows you to create a text that is connected to a certain input field. So imagine we have an input of type text that allows you to type in a gamer tag, for example. So you have this input field that allows you to type in a gamer tag, and now you want to create a label, and this label should be connected to this gamer tag. So we can, for example, write a text inside of this label, which could also be write your gamer tag, for example, or write your username, whatsoever. And once we click this text, nothing is going to happen because this label is not yet connected to our gamer tag input field. And to connect your label to your input field, you need to create an ID. And that ID can, for example, be gamer tag or whatever. The ID is something you can choose as you want. The only important thing is that this for tag matches the ID of the input field you want to connect your label to. So in our case, it has to be gamer tag as well. And once we save, we can now click our label basically, and it will highlight or select our input field, and we can just write inside of our input field without having to select the input field separately. And this is all you need to know about inputs in HTML. Today, we learn all you need to know about HTML forms. You can create an HTML form by using the form tag. You have an opening and a closing tag, and the form usually an important attributes when working with forms is the action attribute and the method attribute. The action is really important when working with a server or PHP, for example. So the action attribute basically tells where to send this form. So if you basically have a PHP script, you tell that this form will basically be sent to this PHP script, and then this PHP script, for example, would define how to work with the form data. So this is not that important for us right now, but it's important to know once you start working with a server. The method basically defines how you send the data you send via this form. And there are basically two ways to send your data. You can use the get method or you can use the post method. If you use the get method right here, your data will basically be appended to your URL and everyone can see it. And if you imagine you have a form with, for example, a username and a password, and you append this username and the password to your URL, it's probably not the best idea because this would definitely not be secure. And if anyone would read out your URL or stuff like that, he would be able to get access to your username and your password, which obviously isn't something you want to do. So if you want to use a secure way to send your data, you always use the post method. And by using the post method, your data, which you send to the server, is basically encrypted. So if you have important data like a credit card number, a password, whatsoever, always make sure to use the post method. When do you even use the get method? method. So the get method is really good if you have like websites where you have parameters like the colors of shoes and so on. So imagine you're browsing on an online store website and there are different colors. You could basically take the color the user selected, save that color in the URL, for example. The user can copy the link, for example, and if he uses the same link to get to the same website later on, he has already pre-selected the certain color. So the get method is really useful if you want to bookmark a page, for example, and pre-select certain filters, for example. Inside of this form, you can use as many input fields as you want. We can, for example, use a text input field that could have the name username and the ID of username. Let's take a placeholder of username and say that this input field basically receives the username. Now let's add a second input field that, for example, takes a password as well. We add a name of password and an ID of password again, and a placeholder of password, for example. So now we accept a username and a password. Imagine this is a register form. You will obviously also need a button to submit this register form, so the username and the password, to a server, for example. And we can create this submit button by using an input field of type submit. And now we can create a value, which could, for example, be register. And once we save, we have this register button right here. And this value is basically the text that you see over here. And every time you use a form where you want to submit data to a server, for example, you need an input field of type submit, or a button that basically submits your data to the server. And once you have this submit button, and once I click on this register button, but since we didn't really define a location to submit this file to, we are basically getting this error page. And as I already mentioned, you'll usually have a PHP file, for example, where you redirect to. So we could, for example, say, okay, we get to the index.php file, for example, once we submit this form. And now we can like reload this, but obviously we don't have this index.php file, so we get an error. But this is basically the way forms work in HTML. As you can see, if we use the get method right here and we type in a username like hello and a password of monkey, and then we press register, you can see that we basically have this URL now, which has a username, which equals hello, and a password, which equals monkey. And imagine you have a friend and you want to share a link with him, and you basically just copy this, and you have your password and your username basically saved in here. You send it to your friend would see your password and your username, which would obviously be like really risky, not a secure site, and nothing you ever want to do. So in this case, you could, as I mentioned, use the post method. And now if we use the post method right here and we type in a username and a password and press register, there's nothing saved inside of our URL. Inside of a form, you can use the field set tag to group certain elements to a logical group basically. So we can, for example, copy this, use the field set tag, and inside of this field set tag, we'll save our username and our password. Now let's go to the bottom and we'll reload our page. And as you can see, we basically have this group of username and password right now. We could, for example, create a second field set, and we could say that we'll add an input of type text right here, and we'll accept a gamer tag right here with an ID of gamer tag again, and a placeholder of gamer tag, for example. And now we have this second field, so this second group basically, that could, for example, group game related information. And by doing so, you can basically create different subgroups inside of a form. Inside of this field set, you can use a legend if you want to do so. And inside of this legend, you could create a description for this group. So this could, for example, be gamer information, if you want to say so. And now you have this gamer information inserted into this group, and you could create a second legend for your general user information, for example, and name this user information. So now you would basically have two groups, one group that contains all of the user information and one group that contains all of the gamer information inside of one form. Now I want to go over certain attributes that are really important when working with forms, and one of them is basically the placeholder. We've already seen the placeholder just gives you a hint text basically that shows you what this input field is used for. You can also add the required field. If you add the required field to your form and press register now, it will give you a warning saying that you have to fill out this field. By using the value attribute for a field, you can create a predefined value that will show up to the user once he loads the page. So you could, for example, say I am a user. And once I load the page, you can see that our username field is basically pre-populated with the value. If we create a check mark, for example, so a checkbox by using input checkbox, we have the checked attribute, which says that the field should basically be checked once the page is loaded. So once the user gets on the page, the checkbox is already checked when using the checked attribute. And this is all you need to know to understand forms in HTML. Today we'll understand the text area in HTML. To create a text area, you can use the text area tag. Feel free to create a name attribute and an ID attribute. In our case, we use message for the name and for the ID. You can also have a placeholder text for every text area, which could say message, for example, as well. In addition to that, you can define the number of columns for every row. So we could, for example, say that we want 50 columns for every single row. And as you can see, our message field gets a little bit wider now. Now we can also define the number of rows by using the rows attribute, and we could, for example, say that we want to use 10 rows in total for our text area. In addition, we can define a max length to define the maximum number of characters the user can enter into this input field, basically. So if we say 10 characters is our max length, for example, we can, for example, type numbers from 1 to 9, and the 11th number will not work anymore, as you can see. If we create a longer text input field by using a max length of 100, for example, we can now save that file and we can type in a lot more characters if we want to. And this is all you need to know about the text area in HTML. Today we learn how to do a drop-down menu in HTML. To create a drop-down menu, we use the select tag, and now we can fill out the name and the ID attribute for the select element. Imagine we want to have a list of fruits, for example. Then we can use fruits for the name attribute, for example, and fruits for the ID attribute, for example. And now to create different subgroups inside of the select element, we could create an opt group by using the opt group tag, and inside of this opt group tag we can create different selectable elements by using the option tag. And inside of this option tag we can choose a value like banana, for example, and then we can decide what text the user should basically see once he opens the drop-down menu, and in our case we want to display banana to the user. And once we save our website, we can already see that we have this drop-down menu which only has one single item, which is a banana basically right now. So imagine we want to have maybe a second item inside of this option group. Then we can create a second option tag, and maybe we can use the name apple for this one, and we want to create an apple option. And once we save, we now have the banana option and the apple option. Now we might have a second option group which maybe includes different elements, like let's say we want to have melons inside of the second option group. So we can say we'll have a honey melon, which is the value basically. And we use honey melon for the text. And now we have two option groups, as you can see here, one for banana and the apple, and the second one for the honey melon. And as you can see, they are separated within the drop-down menu. Now we could, for example, create a second melon type like the watermelon by doing so. And now we replace the honey with the watermelon. And once we save our web page, we now have the watermelon as well. And this is all you need to know about the select statement in HTML. Let's learn all you need to know about buttons in HTML. You can create a button by using the button tag. Inside of the button tag, you can define the text that you want to display on the button. So it could be, for example, a register button. Now you can click this button, but nothing is happening right now. To define a certain type for a button, you use the type attribute, and now you can, for example, create a button of type button, a button of type reset, or a button of type submit. So let's create a button of type submit in this case. To really use the submit button, you have to use this button inside of a form. So let's do that. We're going to create a form by using the form tag, and we will use the get method in this case, but this doesn't really matter in our case. So let's take the button and put it inside of our form. And once we click on the submit button inside of the form, we will submit our form. And now you will see the difference. Once we click the button, you can see that it reloads the document right on the top. And if we define an action attribute that basically tells our form where to send the data, and now pressing the button, it basically redirects us to our index.php, which does not exist on our page, but as you can see, the form is basically working. We could also create a button of type reset, for example, and if we click this button right now and rename it to reset, you can see that basically nothing is happening because we don't have any input elements in our form yet. But we could change it by creating a text element, for example, and say that this is the text element for a username. So we give it a placeholder text of type or of username as well. And now we can basically enter some text right here. And if we press the reset button, it will reset the entire values inside of our form. You can also execute a JavaScript function by using the onClick attribute inside of HTML. But this will be further discussed inside of my JavaScript course. So this is all you need to know about buttons in HTML. To create a video in HTML, we can use the video tag. The video tag has a source attribute that allows you to define the location of your video. So first of all, we obviously need to get a video. So to get a video, we go to Pexels, and on the website, we can basically select videos. With 30 videos here, we are just going to download the first one. Doesn't really matter which one though, since we are just going to test this. We press the download button, and once the video is downloaded, we can take the video and drag it into our folder. We can now rename it to make it easier to get the path, basically. We can, for example, say this is a street.mp4. Now we close this video. We could also preview the video right here if we wanted to. And inside of our HTML file, we have to define the path to our video. So we could either go and copy the path, or we could just type in street.mp4 since we are in the same folder right now. And once we do so, we should already be able to see the video on our web page. So you basically see it's as easy as that. To embed a video, but like this, it obviously doesn't make too much sense because the video is too big. The user can't really play the video because you see it right now, it's just an image, and so on. So the first thing we can add is basically the controls attribute, which would add some controls to the video. So now the user could press the play and the pause button. Since we might not like the width of the video, we could also add the width attribute and say that we want to use 500 pixels, for example. So as you can see, the video is a lot smaller right now. We could also define a height, but this doesn't make too much sense in my opinion, because the height usually automatically adapts to the width, and by changing the height, you would basically destroy the aspect ratio. If you would, for example, say that the height is, for example, 700, you can see that this looks pretty weird. But yeah, I just want to make sure that you know that this would work as well. Now, if we load the website, the video is basically not playing at all. So the user first has to click on the play button, and then he can click on the pause button, which might be the way you want it to be. But sometimes you might want to use the autoplay option to immediately start to play the video once the user lands on the page. And as you can see, now the video immediately starts. And this oftentimes happens if you think about the website when you have like a header on the top without the controls attribute. And now once the user lands on the page, he basically has a video that is basically the header and, for example, shows what a company is doing and so on. So yeah, that might be a use case where autoplay might be really useful. We could also add the loop attribute, which just makes the video loop. So if we go to the end of the video, for example, and we'll wait until it's over, it basically just restarts again. We could add the muted attribute if we want to mute the video, but since this video does not have any sound anyways, this doesn't really matter. But once we remove the muted attribute, you can see that we have this speaker right here, and once we add the muted attribute, you can see that we have this muted speaker right here. You could also create a poster, so basically a thumbnail, a preview image, however you want to call it, by using the poster attribute, and now define the poster you want to use. And we have this image basically inside of our folder that has the name image.png. So we could basically use that as a preview image. And now if I'm going to remove the autoplay, we should just see our preview poster basically, which yeah, looks terrible in this case, but this is something you could basically do. I'm going to remove it because I prefer the normal way. So the last attribute that I want to show you that you'll probably not use that often is the preload attribute, but you have 3 different options for preloading your video, which basically means once the user gets on the page, how should the browser load the video. If you use auto, the browser will automatically decide whether he preloads the video or whether he does not preload the video. If you use metadata, the browser will just preload metadata for the video. And if you choose none, the browser will basically not preload anything. And if you preload data, this basically means that once the user gets to the video is preloaded to a certain extent already, and this obviously means that the user will be able to see the video faster, but this also means that the user will use more data to load this video. If your website is mainly being displayed on a phone, you can imagine that this would take a lot of mobile data to preload the videos, and in that case it might not make too much sense to get the browser to preload the video. But in our case, we just put this to auto, for example, and yeah. And this is all you need to know about videos in HTML. Today, we learn about absolute and relative paths in HTML. First of all, to understand what a path is, we use the image tag, because this really gives us the chance to understand them. And if I'm in the index.html file right now, I need to define the path to my image.png to display an image. So I can, in this case, just say, okay, the image is in the image folder and this will display the image basically. Now, what would happen if I would actually create a new folder and say that this is my images folder, and I'll drag my image inside of the images folder. Now I have this image in the images folder, and now we are not seeing the image anymore because the image tag can't find the image at this location. So we need to define a location. And if you think about a website, it's basically structured like a normal folder on your PC. And you can navigate within your folder, you can go into a folder, you can go backwards, and so on. And you can do the same when writing code, but it looks a little bit different. So just think about a normal folder, but you have to navigate through the folder with code basically. It makes it a lot easier if you just think about this in terms of normal folders. Now, if we want to get our image, previously our image tag was in the same folder as our index.html, so the file we are basically editing right now. So if the image is in the same folder like the index.html or the file you're editing at this time, you can just use the name of the file, because it's obviously in the same folder, so you can just say image.png, but it's not in the same folder. So how do we get into the folder? As you already saw, we can just type images, because that is the path to our images folder. And by going into images, or by writing images / we go into our images folder. And now that we are inside of our images folder, we can see all of the content that is inside of our images folder. So we can basically select our image.png. And by doing so, you'll see we have the image right here again. But what would actually happen if we would create a new folder that says, for example, HTML files. And now I'll drag my index.html into my HTML files folder. Now, to get to my images folder, I first of all need to get back up into my HTML folder. And then from the HTML folder, I need to get into my images folder. And here inside of my images folder, I need to select my image.png. So I'm inside of the HTML files folder right now because I'm inside of my index.html. So I go one step up and then I go into the images folder. And I can go one step up by using // and by doing so, we now went one folder up, so one step up. Now we are inside of the HTML folder. Inside of the HTML folder, I can now select my images folder by using images /, and by doing so, I go into the images folder again. Now that I'm inside of the images folder, I can select my image.png file. And by doing so, we should see our image.png, but we are actually not, because we didn't open our index.html with the live server at the right location. But as you can see, once we reopen with the live server, it now has the right location as well, right here, because now our index.html is inside of HTML files / index.html. So we needed to reopen that file, and now it displays our image once again. Now the thing that I explained to you is a relative path, because we are thinking in a way that is relative to the folder we are working in right now. So the path we defined here is relative to our index.html file, so the file we are working on right now. There also exists the option to define an absolute path. Now let's define an absolute path. If we use an absolute path, we always think as if we start from the root folder of the project. And as you can see, we right now opened the HTML folder. So HTML is basically the root folder of our project, and everything else is inside of this root folder. So HTML files is a folder inside of the root folder HTML. Images is a subfolder of HTML, and so on. App.js is a file inside of the HTML folder whatsoever. And to start from an absolute path, you just use a slash in the beginning. And as you can see, it shows already in the code editor everything that is basically inside of our root folder. Inside of our root folder, we have the app.js, we have the content.html, we have the HTML files, and so on. So if we want to get into images, we basically use a slash, images slash, and by doing so we are going into the images folder, and now we select our image.png and we have our image right here once again. So there are two options to navigate in HTML. You can use absolute paths and you can use relative paths. When using a relative path, you always define the location of something relative to the file you're currently working on. If you use an absolute path, you always think as if you're working or starting from the root directory, and everything else works exactly the same. Navigating works the same. If you use // for example, you go one folder up. If you use images slash, for example, you navigate into the folder, or let's just say folder slash, so just the folder name and then a slash, you navigate into the folder, and so on. And that is all you need to know about relative and absolute paths in HTML. What is a comment in HTML? A comment is a piece of code that will not be executed. So it is basically just an information that you use for yourself or for other developers. I can create a comment by using this kind of syntax. And everything that goes in between those two lines, in between those two code blocks basically, is a comment and will not be executed. So I can basically just use whatever. I can, for example, write some basic information about this page. And if I save this file, you can see that you can't see anything. And the reason for this is that the code will not be executed in here. So you could basically give some information for another developer or for yourself inside of this code block. Maybe you want to have some more information down here and maybe some more information down here. And this is like really helpful about comments because you can organize and structure your code, get some extra information, and so on. And this is all you need to know about comments in HTML. CSS was invented in 1996 and stands for Cascading Style Sheet. It's the language that controls the style and layout of a website. While HTML builds the structure, things like headings, paragraphs, and buttons, CSS makes them look good by adding colors, spacing, fonts, animations, layouts, and more. CSS works by selecting HTML elements and applying rules to them. This rule, for example, targets all H1 elements and gives them the color red and a font size of 2 rem. There are three ways to use CSS. Inline, using the style attribute. Internal, using a style tag inside HTML. External, by linking a separate CSS file, which is the best practice. The cascading in CSS means that styles are applied in order of priority. Inline applies before internal, which applies before external. And if the same rules exist, the last one wins. CSS also uses selectors like classes.button, IDs like #hero, and pseudo-classes like :hover to style elements interactively. In short, HTML builds the foundation, CSS makes it beautiful. There exist three ways to embed CSS code into your HTML file. Let's imagine we have this h1 tag that has some form of heading, for example, inside. And now we want to target this h1 tag. The first way to do so is by using the style tag inside of the head. So we can use style right here, and now we can define our styles right here. So we can, for example, say h1, and now let's say we want to have a color for our h1 of red, for example. We're going to save the document. And as you can see, now we have a red heading, and we can also say we want to have a blue heading, for example. So we can define whatever color we want right here. And by using the color property, you just define the color of a font. There's also another way to achieve the exact same result by using the style attribute instead of the h1 tag. So we can say style right here, for example. And now we can say we want to have a color, for example, of, let's say, brown. And now our h1 has the color of brown. The third way to define colors, and the preferred method for you, will be the link tag inside of the head. So you can say that you want to use a link inside of the head element of type CSS. And as you can see, by using the shortcut, you generate a link that has the relationship attribute, which essentially defines that this is going to be a style sheet in our case. And inside of the href attribute, you define the path to the style sheet. And in our case, we want to have the style sheet in the exact same folder because we have it in the exact same folder. And the name of the style sheet is obviously style.css. So by using this syntax, we've now defined that this style sheet in the same folder will be the style sheet that we're going to use to style our elements inside of HTML. So now, for example, we could say that we want to select the h1 element right here inside of our style sheet, and we want to give our h1 a color of, for example, let's use blue violets so we can see a difference. We're going to save the file, and as you can see, now we have this blue violet title right here. So to sum up, you can either use the style tag inside of the head, you can use inline styles inside of the tag right here, or you can link a style sheet by using link rel equals style sheet, href equals a name of your style sheet right here. So those three ways exist, and the preferred method for you should almost always be using the link tag. Target an element inside of CSS, there exist a couple of different selectors. The first selector is the element selector. You can use the element selector by going inside of your linked style sheet. So we've linked our style sheet by using the link tag right here. We've linked our style.css file, and now we can use an element selector by just using the element name. So in our case, we want to style an h1 tag. So the element name is h1. We are going to use opening and closing brackets right here. And inside of those brackets, we can now define our style. So we can say color should, for example, be blue. We're going to save this, and now our heading has a blue color. And to show you that this really works, we can also say that we want to have a p tag with some placeholder tag. And now the element selector would have the name p essentially because the element is a p element, so a paragraph element. So we can say p will have a color of yellow, for example, which will look terrible, but as you can see, we now have a yellow color. The next selector we can use is the class selector. So we can also go to our tag inside of HTML and give this one a class of, for example, my-heading. Now we can copy this class name, go inside of our style sheet. We're going to delete both of those selectors. And by using dot and the name of the class right here, we can use the class selector. So now we've again selected our h1 right here, but this time we've used a class name. And now we can say we want to have a color, for example, of aqua, for example. And now we have an aqua color right here. Besides the class selector, we can also use the ID selector. So let's say our paragraph has an ID, for example, of info minus text. So now we've defined an ID for this paragraph, and we can target an ID by using the route instead of the point, followed by the ID name. So this is how you select an ID. Now again, opening and closing brackets. And let's say we want to use a color, for example, of, again, let's say beige. And now we have this text, which is barely visible because the color is pretty similar to white. Now there also exists the universal selector, which is just an asterisk. Again, we can use opening and closing brackets. And now we can just say, okay, let's use a color of red, for example. We're going to save this. And as you can see, now our paragraph as well as our h1 are red. And the reason is that the universal selector usually selects every single element. So now let's delete this. And let me show you some other selectors. Let's imagine we are having a div, for example. And inside of this div, we're going to have a paragraph. And inside of this paragraph, we have a couple of words, for example. And let's duplicate this paragraph, for example. So now we have this paragraph twice. And let's create a third paragraph that probably has a text last paragraph. So now imagine we wanted to select those paragraphs right here. In order to do so, we could essentially say that we want to target every p tag that is inside of a div. And this is really, really simple. We can just say, let's target a div that has a paragraph inside of it. And by using this syntax, you're saying we're targeting every p tag inside of a div. So now let's use this syntax, and we're going to say color is going to be red, for example, or Rebecca purple. And as you can see, now we have those texts that are essentially Rebecca purple, while the last paragraph that is not inside of a div does not have a color at all. But now let's imagine we would have another div, for example. And one of those p tags is inside of another div. Let's say this div has a class of, for example, container. And this div has a class of subcontainer, for example. So now if we would say, for example, dot container p, as you can see, we still have the same effect. And the reason for this is that this container is essentially a wrapper for this div and is essentially a wrapper for this paragraph. and a wrapper for this paragraph. So both of those paragraphs are inside of this container div. So as you can see, it doesn't matter how deeply nested a paragraph is. By using this syntax, the effects will be applied. But if you just want to target the direct child, you have to use this symbol right here. And as you can see, now I'm going to save, and only the direct child will get this color, while the nested child will not have that color anymore because it's not a direct child of the container div. It's a direct child of the subcontainer div, but it's not a direct child of the container div. Now there also exists the adjacent selector, and let me demonstrate you by using a couple of p tags. For example, every p tag will have a couple of words inside, and we're just going to duplicate it 4 times, for example. And let's say our first p tag will have a class of first, for example. So now we can say we want to target our first element, but let's imagine we wanted to target this p tag right here. So the first p tag that follows the p tag with the class first. And in order to target that one, we can use a plus symbol. So now we can say first dot first plus p, which essentially means select the first p tag that follows the element with the class of first. So this could also be a div right here. That wouldn't really matter too much. So we can just use a div here, and it wouldn't really make a difference because it still has the same exact class. We're going to save this, and we're going to say, give that p tag a color of blue, for example. And as you can see, now our second p tag has a color of blue because this is the first p tag that follows an element with a class of first. If we wanted to select every single one, we would need to use this symbol right here, which essentially means select every single sibling on the same level. We're going to save this, and as you can see, we've now targeted every single sibling on the same level. So essentially everyone next to this p tag. If you would have a div afterwards and a p tag afterwards with some words, as you can see, p tag would still be affected while the div would not be affected because the div is essentially not a p tag. So not a p tag that is a direct sibling to our .first class. Essentially, let me show you some tricks at the end. We also have, let's imagine we have an h1 that has some words. Let's imagine we have an h2, for example, that also has some words. And let's say we have an h3 as well. And that one has a word as well. So now if we wanted to target all of them at the same time, we could say h1, comma, h2, comma, h3. And now we can define the styles for all 3 elements at once by saying color is equal to aqua, for example. And as you can see, all elements have the color aqua right now. We could also use some stacking, for example. So we can, for example, say class, and this one has, for example, class heading and class of hey bro, for whatever reason. And now we could say that we want to target our h1, for example, that has a class of dot heading, for example. And now we say this one should have a color of red or Rebecca purple. And as you can see, we've targeted that class right here. And it would also work if we would go ahead and say, okay, let's say we are going to write dot hey bro 1, for example. So this is wrong. So if we're going to delete the 1 right now, this is true, and we're getting this effect. So this syntax essentially means target an h1 that also has the class of heading and also has the class of hey bro. And if one of those things is not fulfilled, we are not going to apply the style. So if this one is hey bro 2, for example, so that class does not exist for the element, even though heading and h1 is essentially true, it is not going to apply the style. So all of those properties essentially need to be true to apply those styles. And sometimes you also have some attributes. So let's, for example, say we are going to use an anchor tag, which obviously usually has an href attribute that is probably going to target whatever site, doesn't really matter though, and probably has a text of Google. So we're going to have this anchor tag. And now we can say that we want to target every anchor tag that essentially, for example, let's say that has an empty string. Wouldn't make really too much sense in a real world application, but let's imagine we are going to target every anchor tag that has an empty attribute href. And we can do so by saying, let's target an a tag that has, and we're going to use those brackets right here to define an attribute. And now inside of these brackets, we can, for example, say if an anchor tag has an href that is equal to empty quotes, we can apply a color of, let's say, for example, brown. We're going to save this, and as you can see, now we have brown color for this Google attribute. If you would say Google right here, for example, and going to save this, you can see that the brown color disappears. And the reason is that this anchor tag does not have the attribute of href equals Google anymore. But if we are going to go into our index.html and say href is equal to Google, for example, now those brackets become true again, and we are going to apply the style again. To style text, we first need to create a sample text that we can use to style. And we use some placeholder tags right here and save the website. And inside of our style.css, we can select this text now by using the P selector, for example. And first of all, let's say we want to change the color of our text. And we can do so by using the color attribute. And right here, you can basically select any color by just typing the name, for example. And the second option to change the color would actually be selecting a hash code, for example. So you could, for example, say use hashtag FFF, for example, which is white. Or you can say, let's use 000, which is black, for example. But you can also obviously define the hash code by using any other color, or you can hover over this color picker right here and just select a different color code and save the document. And right here, you can basically see the chosen color right now. So you can either use the name, or you can use the hash code to define the color. And the third option would be using RGB values by typing RGB. And inside of here, you can select the portion of red, the portion of green, and the portion of blue you want to have. And that scale goes from 0 to 255. The higher the value, the higher the portion of red we'll basically use. So if we say, for example, we want to use 250 of red, 0 of green, and 0 of blue, we get a red text. If we say we want to have a portion of 0 red and 255 of green, for example, we get green text. And the same obviously works for blue. So if we say 0 green, 0 red, and 255 blue, we get a blue text. And obviously we can also mix those two colors. So we could say we want to have 100 of green, for example. And you see the text change slightly. Now we can say we want to have 255 of red, for example, and we get a different color as well. So by using RGB, you basically say which portion of which color do you want to use to create a new color. Because in the end, every color is obviously made up of different colors, and by mixing colors, you generate a new color. And red, green, and blue are basically the base colors. So if you have 255 for each of those values, you get white. If you have 0 for all of those values, you'll get black. Now there's basically an extension to RGB, if you want to say so, by using RGBA. And if you use RGBA, you also have the alpha channel, which means you can also set the transparency. If I say, for example, that I want a transparency of 0.6, you see that the text is slightly transparent now. I can also say that I want to have a transparency of 0.1, which means the text is almost fully transparent. And the scale of transparency goes from 0, which means it's fully transparent, so it's invisible to the user, to 1, which means it's fully visible. The next thing you can do is basically change the font family. So we can use font minus family to define a font family. Now we have some base fonts that we can choose from. So we could, for example, say we want to use impact, and we'd save the file. And as you can see, we basically have a different font right now. To change the font size, we can use the font minus size property. We'll save that. And now we can, for example, say that we want to use 16 pixels for our font size, which is basically the base font size. So nothing is really changing. But if we say we want to have 26 pixels, for example, we see that our font is a lot bigger now. To change the thickness of our font, we use the font weight property by using font minus weight. And right here you can see different values. 400 is basically standard, so nothing will change. 600 should also be a little bit bolder. 700 is actually even bolder. And right here we also can use bold, bolder, lighter, normal, and so on. So 400 is usually normal, and just feel free to experiment with those values a little bit. And you can also use names like bold to define a bold font, normal to define a normal font size basically, and lighter to define a lighter version, which does not exist for this type of font family. So we are going to delete this font family so you can see the difference a little bit better. And not every font supports all types of styles. So basically, if you have a font that does not support light, for example, then you just have the normal version of the font. But this would be the way to do it if the font supports different styles. You can use the text align property to align the text to the center, to the left, to the right, and so on. So let's say we want to center our text. We can just do so by using the center property. And if you use Visual Studio Code, you'll see basically an indication once you type a colon of what is possible anyways. So you could obviously center, left, right, and so on. We want to go to the right, for example, we save our file and now our font is at the right. Text decoration might be useful in some cases for you as well. You can basically define whether your text should be underlined, dotted, have a line through, and so on. So this is basically some additional styling if you want to say so. So let's say we want to have an underline because that is something that is really common. And once you save the document, you'll see that your text is underlined now. So yeah, you could also say you want to have a line through, for example. Now you have a line going through your text, which might not be the most common use case, but maybe you want to have that, and so on. So just experiment with that as well, and you'll see how it goes. So let's just delete those styles for the next styles, and let's create a text that is slightly longer by adding some characters or some words. And now we can add a line height, for example, which basically just is what it says. It basically just defines the height between your lines. So we can say that we want to have a line height of, for example, 30 pixels. And now, as you can see, the space between the lines is slightly bigger. The next option we have is the letter spacing, which again is just the spacing between the letters. So we can say we want to have a letter spacing of 30 pixels, for example, and now we have a pretty big letter spacing, which might be way too big, but in some cases you might want to have text like this, for example, since you think it's pretty cool or whatever. To understand units, let's create a div first of all, and let's target this div inside of CSS by using the div selector. Now let's give our div a certain width by using the width property and say that our div has a width of 100 pixels, and let's give it a height by saying it has a height of 100 pixels. And to make our div visible, we can use the background color property and give a background color of aqua, for example. And as you can see, we have our div right here. I already use pixels right here, and pixels is the unit you really use pretty often, and it's just a fixed size. So let me draw an example for you so you basically understand pixel. Imagine you have this type of monitor. This is basically what it looks like. Even though you can't really see it, your screen is basically divided into a lot of pixels. And if you have an HD screen, it contains 1920 pixels for the width, for example, and 1080 pixels for the height, for example. So a pixel is basically just a little square on your screen. And if you take a lot of squares on your screen and combine them, you get an image. And if you want to say so, every HD monitor includes 1920 pixels for every row and has 1080 rows. So basically, if you multiply that number times that number, you get the amount of pixels your monitor uses in total to display an image. So every image you basically see on your monitor is made up of pixels. The pixels are just so small that you can't really see them. But this is something you always want to keep in mind when using pixels. If you say that we want to use a width of 100 pixels, you say that we want to take up 100 of those pixels in this area, for example, to display our div. And the same obviously also goes for the height. The next option to define width and height, for example, is the percent option. So we could also say that we want to use 40% of the width, for example. And as you can see, we now take up 40% of the width. But what exactly is this percent sign? This percent sign says that we want to take up 40% of the width relative to the parent element. And the parent element right now is our body right here. So if we say that our body should, for example, have a width of 200 pixels, for example, you'll see our box getting a lot smaller because our body is a lot smaller now. And the body now just takes up 200 pixels, which is basically probably around that. And our div takes up 40% of those 200 pixels. So it's basically a lot smaller now. If we say that our body has a width of 1000 pixels, for example, you see that our div will get a lot bigger because our div takes up 40% of 1000 pixels right now. So basically 40% of the parent element width. M and rem are two different units which you mostly use to change the size of text. So we create a text to really take a look at it by using a paragraph, for example, and having some placeholder text. Doesn't even have to be that much, like that. And now let's target that paragraph by using the p tag and using opening and closing brackets. And now we can say that we want to use a font size, for example, of probably 2M. As you can see, this font is like super big. If we use 1M, it would basically mean just use the default font size. If we use 2M, it would basically mean use twice that font size, and so on. And if you use rem right now, you would not see a difference. So why is that? The difference between M and rem is that M is relative to the font size of the parent, while rem is relative to the font size of the root element. So to really show you the difference, let me change the font size of the root element, which is the HTML element. So this is the root element. And now we can change the font size to, let's say, 40 pixels. So we really see the difference. And as you can see, if we change the font size of our HTML element and we use a font size of 2 rem, for example, which is twice the font size of the root element, so basically 80 pixels right now, we have a font size of 80 pixels right now. But if we change this to M, for example, nothing is going to change. So why is that? That is because every child in HTML inherits the font size of the parent element. And since our body is a part of our HTML, so of our root element, our body will inherit a font size of 40 pixels as well. And the body is the direct parent to our p tag. And since M always defines the font size relative to the font size of the parent element, which is body in our case, and since body inherits the font size of HTML element, so the root element, nothing really changes. But if we go to our body element, which is the direct parent to our p tag, and we change the font size here, for example, to, let's say, 10, for example, 10 pixels, you can see a difference. So if we go and use 2M right now, we change the font relative to the direct parent element, which is the body. And if we use rem right now, we use the font size of the root element. So we change our font size relative to the root element's font size, which is 40 pixels. So this is basically the difference between rem and m. You can also say that rem refers to the root element because of the r in rem, and m always refers to the parent element because there's no r in m. The next properties I want to show you are viewport width and viewport height. And they are pretty much self-explanatory. The viewport width refers to the width of the viewport, and the viewport height refers to the height of the viewport. So basically the height of the screen and the width of the screen. So let's go and target our div element. We can, for example, say that we want our div to have a width of, for example, 40% of the entire viewport width by using this kind of syntax. And now we can, for example, define a height as well and say we want a height of, for example, 80% of the viewport height. So this is relative to the height of the viewport, for example. And now we can say we want to have a background color of, let's say, yellow, for example. And as you can see, our div now takes up 40% of the viewport width and 80% of the viewport height. So in case I increase the size of the viewport by making it wider, for example, you can see that the width of our container is also getting bigger. And this is all you need to know about units in CSS. If we create a div, for example, and want to give this div a certain height and width, we can use CSS to do so. First, let's target the div element, and now we can give that div a certain width by using the width property, followed by a colon. And now we could, for example, define the width in pixels. So let's say our div has a width of 100 pixels, and let's give that div a background color of red, for example, to see what we are really doing. And as you can see, we are not seeing anything. And the reason for that is that we don't have a height right now. So a div with a width of 100 pixels and a height of 0 is still invisible, basically. So we need to add a height, which we can do by using the height property. And now we can define a height of 50 pixels, for example. And now you can basically see that our div has a width of 100 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. And oftentimes you use width and height when it comes to defining the width and the height of a div, for example. So let's understand the box model in CSS. Right now we have this div container that has a height and a width of 100 pixels and a background color of red. To really understand the box model, it makes sense to right-click our website and press on Inspect and go into the developer tools. And once you see the element tab right here and scroll down a little bit, you can see the box model. So if we open our body now and go to the div and select our div element, you can see that the div has a height and a width of 100 pixels. So let's inspect the div inside of the box model. And as you can see, inside of the box model, you can see that we have 100x100 right here. So this is basically the width times the height. And in terms of the box model, the thing you see inside of here is basically the content. Right next to the content, we have the padding. Next to the padding, we have a border. And next to the border, we have the margin. And this is something you can really visualize by using the properties padding, border, and margin. So let's imagine we want to add a border to our content. So we can do so by using border. Then we can define the thickness of the border for the first parameter. So we can, for example, say that the thickness of our border is 10 pixels. There are different types of borders. We can, for example, say that we want to use a solid border, which is just a normal line. And we want to have a color of black, for example. And as you can see, we now have a border with a thickness of 10 pixels that is solid. And as you can see, if we take a look at our box model, we now have a content of 10 with padding of 0 and we have a border of 10 pixels. So if you want to add some space between the border and the content, you can use padding, as you can see right here. So we can use padding of 10 pixels, for example. And you don't really need to understand padding right now, but just remember that you can use the padding property to add some padding to our content. So now we have our content. As you can see, it visualizes once I hover over the content area of 100 times 100. Now we have a padding of 10, which is also visualized if you take a look at the box. And now we have a border of 10. So if we add more padding, for example, by adding 100, you'll see the difference pretty clearly. Now we have a super big amount of padding, we have some content inside, and we have a border. But now let's get back to padding of 10, for example. So if you want to add some space outside of the border, to the left and the right, for example, you usually use the margin. So let's use a margin of 20 pixels, for example. And as you can see, our container is now further apart from the top and the left because we added some margin around our content, for example. And this would make a lot of sense, for example, if you think about us having, for example, 3 disks, and now we have some spacing between our boxes. If we would remove the margin, you can see that the space is also removed because there's no margin around our boxes. Now, one thing you probably realize is that we add some more padding, like 40 pixels, for example, our boxes get a lot bigger. This basically means that once we have a content and we add some padding, that padding is added to the content. But oftentimes you probably want to define a width and a height, and then you don't want these boxes to get any bigger. And in order to do so, you can use the box sizing property, and the default value is content box, which just means you have a box around the content and padding and border is added on top of the content. So the box basically goes around the content. And the alternative is border box, which basically means width and height define the width and the height of the border box. So everything that goes up to the border. So if we just save this, you can see that our boxes are getting a lot smaller right now because width and height now defines the width and the height of everything up to our border. So everything up to this point. So padding, border, and content are all part of our box model. And the reason this is called the box model is because you can literally think about it in terms of boxes. You have a box, and inside of this box you have the content. After the content you have the padding. After the padding you have the border. And after the border you have the margin. And a lot of people use padding and margin to generate space around something. If you think about a paragraph, for example, with some text, and now we add some padding to this text, for example, of 100 pixels, you can see that this doesn't really make a difference if we use margin instead of padding. But if you think about the box model, it obviously makes a difference, and there is a difference between using margin and padding. Even though when using padding and margin with the paragraph, for example, you oftentimes can't really tell the difference. But it's really important to keep that in mind because oftentimes you really need to understand the difference between margin and padding. And this is all you need to know to understand the box model in CSS. Let's learn about backgrounds in CSS. First of all, we create a div that we can style in CSS. Now we target that div and give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. The first property you can use to give color to a background is the background color option, where you can basically define a color by just typing in the name, like black, for example. Another option to define the color using the background color property is defining the color by using a hash. You can, for example, use hash FFF, which would be equal to white. And now you can also hover over the color and select a new color from the color picker right here, for example. And you can always use this hash to define a color. Another option besides this color picker in Visual Studio Code would be to use a color picker from Google, for example, by just typing color picker into Google, for example. And then right here, you can, for example, copy a color, and you have the hex code right here. You can copy the hex code and paste the hex code into Visual Studio Code. And now once we save the document, you'll see that we have this color. The next option would be to use RGB. We can use a value for red, green, and blue. So if we take 0, 0, 0 for red, green, and blue, we have black, for example. If we take 255 for red, we obviously have red. If we take 255 for green, we would obviously have green. And if we take 255 for blue, we would obviously have blue. And we can mix those colors, so we could, for example, make a combination of green and blue, and we would basically get this color. You can also use RGBA to add an alpha channel, which basically means you can set the transparency as well. 0 means that it's completely transparent, 1 means that it's not transparent at all, and 0.5, for example, means that it's 50% transparent. Besides the background color property, you can also just use the background property, and you could use that to define a color as well, for example. But background color is a little more descriptive, so if you're using a background color, I recommend using the background color property. You can also use the background image property to set an image, for example. If you want to use an image, we obviously first of all have to get an image, and we can use Unsplash, for example, to get an image, but you can get it wherever you want. In our case, we might want to get this image, so we download it for free. Once it's downloaded, we can drag it into our folder, for example. We can rename it to make it easier to target it. Let's say that's a car, for example. Now let's go into our document again, and we can define the path to the image by using the URL property and define the path to our image, which is car.jpg for this one. Once we save, we basically get this background image. As you can see, it's way too big right now, so we can use the background size property to define the size of the image. And if you want the image to fit the container, you can basically use contain, for example. So as you can see, the image now fits perfectly into the image. And you can also use cover, which basically means it's covering the entire space. So if we say we have like a width of 1000 and a height of 1000, for example, you can see that it will cover the entire image. So the difference between contain and cover is basically that contain will make the image fit, while cover makes the image cover the entire space, even if you have to cut off a little part of the image. But feel free to test it and you get the hang of it. So let's say that our image has a width of 400 pixels and a height of 400 pixels, for example. Since we have contain, it will fill out the entire height. Now we can also define a background position, for example, and we could, for example, say that we want to have it in the center, at the top, at the bottom, whatsoever. Usually, most of the times, you probably use center. And as you can see, our image is centered in the container right now. But it's also repeating, and that is something you can change with the background repeat property. Repeat like that, and you can basically either select repeat, which is default, or no repeat, which would be, the other value. And as you can see, our image is not repeating anymore, so you only have it one time. You can also define a gradient for the background by using the background property, but if you want to use a gradient, I definitely recommend using an online gradient generator. Obviously, you could do it by hand and learn all of those properties, but this is something you probably never do when it comes to a real application. So I'd recommend going to Google and just typing CSS background gradient generator. Then you'll probably just click the first link, but pretty much everything works. And right here you can basically create different gradients, for example a linear, a radial one, a conic one, whatsoever. And here you can, for example, choose a color. Let's say we want to have a red one to a purple one, the way it is right here. Then we click on a get CSS link. We copied it to our clipboard by pressing this button. And now we can just copy and paste this in. And as you can see, we have those properties, basically the background property combined with the linear gradient property. This property here defines basically the angle of the gradient, and those ones here define the background colors. And as you can see, we have our gradient right here. We can obviously also say that we want to have a 180-degree angle like this. So you can adjust that one either using CSS or just using the CSS gradient generator. I know a lot of people make like 10-minute tutorials just about gradients, but I really think that that's a waste of time. You'll use a gradient generator all of the time anyway, so I think this is the best method and the only method you really need to know. And this one here is pretty much self-explanatory anyways. You can change those colors whenever you want. You can change this angle whenever you want. And that is pretty much all you need to know about gradients in my opinion. So let's understand the difference between block, inline and inline block. First of all, we create two divs inside of HTML, which we can style later on. The first div will have the class of box1, while the second div will have the class of box2. Now we select the first div by using the dot notation for box1 and the second div by using the dot notation for box2. Let's say our first box has a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels as well. Let's give it a background color of probably blanche diamond, whatever that is. And let's just copy those properties and give it to box 2 as well. And change the color probably to some yellow, like this. Now let's use the display block property to see what is going to happen for both of these elements. And as you can see, literally nothing is going to happen because the div element is a block element by default. As we already know from HTML, there exist block and inline elements, and the div is a block element, for example, while the span is an inline element. So what is the difference now? A block element basically usually always takes up the entire space available, and every new block element starts inside of a new row usually. So usually there are not two block level elements next to each other. So if we say that this is an inline element, for example, as you can see, the element completely disappears. And the reason for this is that you can't set width and height for inline elements. Usually an inline element takes up the minimal necessary space to display the content. Since we don't have any content inside of the box and width and height properties do not apply, the box 1 element, so basically the div, completely disappears. So if I set this box 2 to inline as well, it will disappear as well. So what are the options right now? What if we wanted to have both of these elements next to each other, but we also want to keep the block level properties, like being able to define the width and the height for the element? And in that case, you can use the inline block property right here. And as you can see, it appeared right here. And now let's copy inline block to our second box. And as you can see, we have two inline block elements right here that go next to each other once they have the available space, as you can see. So basically, inline block combines the best out of a block and an inline element and allows those two elements to basically keep the block properties, like being able to define width and height basically, while also having inline properties, like just taking up the minimal available space and allowing other elements to sit right next to this element. Let's understand the flexbox. In order to do so, we first create 3 divs, having the name container 1, container 2, and container 3. 2 and 3, like that. Now we create a width and a height for each of those containers. Let's say 100 pixels of width, 100 pixels of height. Now we copy those values. We'll have a background color of yellow. And now we copy the container 1 and make the same for container 2 and container 3. We just choose a slightly different color for both of these containers to see a difference. So now we have those 3 containers basically. And as you can see, each div takes up the entire space of one row. So what if we wanted to have those divs next to each other? Obviously, we could use inline block, but that is definitely not something you want to do when you have the option to use a flexbox. And in order to use a flexbox, you need to wrap all of those divs with a parent element. And now we can give that parent element a class of, for example, parent container, just make it clear. Now we copy this class parent container and create a selector for that class. And now we want to say, inside of this parent element, I have 3 different divs. And inside of this parent element, I want to have all 3 divs next to each other. That's what we're basically saying. And in order to do so, we can use display, and we can set display, as already mentioned, to block, or inline, but we can also say that we want to have display of flex. And by setting display to flex, we are basically saying take every element inside of our parent container, so take every element that is inside of this div, every direct child basically, and place that direct child next to each other. Another thing that is really nice about that is that we can basically also use the parent element to define the spacing of the child elements. So let's basically say we want to have all of those elements in the middle of our page. We can now use justify content of center and center our elements. We could also use align items to center, and we give our container, our parent container, of height of 100 viewport height basically. So the container takes up the entire space, and justify content basically says justify the content to the center, and align item says align the content to the center. And in this scenario, align items basically refers to the vertical axis. So align the items on the vertical axis in the center. So basically in this axis. justify content right here refers to the horizontal axis. So basically it refers to the row. So we basically use justify content to center along the row and align items to center along the column. But in order to understand how this really works, we need to flex direction, and the default value for flex direction is row. So flex direction row basically means take all of the content inside of the container and arrange it in a row, the way we did it right here. And now let me draw something for you so you really understand it. If our flex direction is set to row, it basically means that we have a main axis and a secondary axis. And since flex direction is row, our main axis, which we indicate by using M, is our row. And our secondary axis is basically our column, like this. Now there's a second type for flex direction, and that second type is column basically. So if we set the flex direction to column, for example, you'll see that our content is now arranged in a column. The primary axis is now the column, and the secondary axis is now our row. So this column is the primary axis now, while this row is the secondary axis right now. So what is the difference basically? Now the content is arranged from top to bottom, while it was previously arranged from left to right. That's obviously the first difference, but the flex direction also changes the way our justify content and align items property work. So let me show you. Let's set flex direction to row again, and let's remove align items again. Now if we set our justify content to center, justify content always refers to the primary axis. And since flex direction is row right now, our primary axis is the row. So justify content basically says along our row, justify our content in the middle, so in the center. So if we change our flex direction to column right now, our column row, so basically our column, becomes our primary axis, and justify content always refers to the primary axis. So justify content now says take our primary axis and align the content in the center along the primary axis, which is the column right now. So once I save this, you can see our content is now centered along the primary axis, which is now the column. So our content is centered along the column. And now if I would use align items always refers to the secondary axis, and our secondary axis, since we use flex direction of column right now, is our row. So align items will now say, if I set it to center the content along the secondary axis, which is our row right now. So I save, and our content will go to the middle of the row right now. So it's really important to understand that flex direction does not only change the direction the flex box basically arranges our content along, but it also changes the way justify content and align items work. And again, justify content always refers to the primary axis, while align items always refers to the secondary axis. And by default, if you don't use flex direction, the primary axis is usually the row. So obviously justify content can not only be set to center, but you can also say that we want to have some space around, some space between, or space evenly. So if I say I want to have some space around the content, it will have some space around every single box. Now I could obviously also say I want to have space between the content, and the difference is that it will have space between the content but not around the content, so there won't be any space to the left and to the right basically. Now you could obviously also say that we want to go with flex start, for example, and now our content is arranged to the left, so basically arranged to the start of the flex box. And we can also use flex end, for example, and now we go to the end of the flex box and we'll arrange our content right there. It works pretty similar for align items, so we could, for example, say align items, center, flex start, flex end, and so on. So we could, for example, say let's go to flex start basically, and we basically go to the start of the flex box along the secondary axis, which is our column right now. We could obviously also say, okay, let's go to flex end, and we'll arrange our content to the end of our flex box. Let's first of all go back to center because it looks a little bit better. And now let's say we want to have a gap in between of the items. So we could use the gap property for that circumstance. And we could say, okay, let's have a gap between every single item of 30 pixels. And now you have a gap between those items of 30 pixels. Now we could obviously also say, okay, we want to have 50 pixels. For this instance, let's say the width of our items is a little bit more and the height is a little bit more. So our items are getting a little bit bigger. Once we save, we basically have this box, if you want to say it like that. And let's also probably create a fourth container with a background color of, yeah, something like that. And we obviously also need to create that container in our HTML file, so we are going to do so. And as you can see, now our boxes basically get smaller. And in order to do so, we can also define inside of the parent container again how our flexbox should basically behave. And in order to do so, we can use the flex wrap property. And the default is basically no wrap, which means no matter what happens, even if the content gets squished like here, don't wrap. And the alternative is basically wrap or wrap reverse. You're just going to use it, and once you activate wrap, basically the content is basically going to wrap into a new row. You can obviously also use wrap reverse, which will just reverse the order of the wrapping basically. But most of the times you just want to use wrap to wrap into a new row. So now let me explain some important concepts. So first of all, let's take a look at the structure again. We have basically those 4 containers, and we have a parent container. Those 4 containers are inside of the parent container, and previously all we did basically happened to the parent container. So we activated display flex in the parent container, we justify the content inside of the parent container, we line the items inside of the parent container. But there's also a way to define for every single element how the element should behave once the amount of space basically changes that every element has, that is basically available to every single element. And that is something you can change for every single element. So we are not going to define that property for the container, but rather for every single element. And the first thing we can basically do is set a flex basis of 100 pixels, for example, and a height of 100 pixels as well. So flex basis in this case defines the width of our element, because our flex direction right now is basically row. If we would change our flex direction to column, it would define the height of the element. So flex basis basically always changes the value along the main axis, which is the row in our case. So we can use flex basis instead of width, while we can use height for the height. So let's use a flex basis of 100 pixels for every single element. Like that. So now we have all of those elements next to each other again. Let's change the gap to probably 10 pixels. But as you can see, there is a lot of available space right here. So couldn't we maybe say that we want container 1 to probably grow as much as he basically can if there's available space? And we could actually do so by using the flex grow property and setting that one to 1. And as you can see, our first container is now taking up all of the available space. Now let's say I want our blue container to grow as well. So I could go ahead and set flex grow for our blue container to 1 as well. And as you can see, our yellow and our blue container now grow and take up all of the available space if there is available space. But maybe we want our container 1, so our yellow container, to grow slightly more than our blue container. So we could, for example, say flex grow is 2 for yellow and 1 for blue. So blue will take up some available space, but yellow will take up a lot more of the available space. And we could obviously also say like 4. So now yellow will take up even more of the available space, while blue will take up a lot less of the available space. And obviously we could also go ahead and set flex grow for the green container, for example, and so on. So this is how you basically define how the element works when there is space available. And the default value for flex grow is 0, which means you don't grow. So if we set yellow to 0, for example, it means just take up the space that flex space is defined and don't take any more space. So we want to have 4 in our circumstance, for example. So now there's also a flex shrink property, and its value is 1 by default. So if we do that, nothing is actually going to change. But let's say that we have a shrink value of 3, for example. And let's say we have a shrink value for the blue box of 2, for example. Now our yellow and our blue box will shrink a lot more. So let's take a look. If I make the window a little bit smaller, you can see our blue box shrinked a little bit, while our yellow box shrinked a lot. Now for flex basis, flex grow and flex shrink, you also have a shortcut property, which is basically just flex. And for flex, the first value is basically the grow factor, the second one is the shrink factor, and the third value is the basis. So basically grow, shrink, basis like this. So let's remove flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And let's say we want to have a grow factor of 5, for example. So we want this one to grow a lot. Now let's say we have a shrink factor of 0, for example. So it's not going to shrink at all. And then let's say we have a basis of 100, or let's say we have a basis of 100 pixels. And that is basically the basis, is basically the point where the element would start to shrink. So if there's space available, it will take up all of the available space basically, or a lot of the available space. It will basically not shrink once it hits 100 pixels. So it will, if you want to say it, shrink up to 100 pixels, because that is basically all the space that it just takes up because of flex grow. But once it reaches this basis, it is not going to shrink because we have a shrink factor of 0. So let's take a look at that. Now I'm going to make the window a little bit smaller, and it will shrink down to 100 pixels basically, and now it will not shrink anymore. Also, let me remove flex wrapped for this test, and now we'll basically take the window, we make it smaller, we make it smaller, we make it smaller, and at a certain point, once it reaches 100 pixels, it's not going to get smaller anymore. And we could also like say, okay, let our green container have a width of, for example, 300 pixels, which makes it a little more obvious. So now the yellow container is basically taking up a lot of space when there's space available, and once we shrink, it basically shrinks down to 100 pixels. And at a certain point, you can see our blue item is really shrinking a lot because we have like a flex shrink factor of 2, but our yellow item is not shrinking at all anymore because we have a flex shrink factor of 0. Like, I hope that is understandable. We could obviously also do the same for the other containers by just using the flex property. So we could basically say flex, and now we want to have a flex grow factor of 1, a flex shrink factor of 2, and a flex basis of 100 pixels basically. And by doing so, we could remove flex shrink, flex basis, and flex grow. I know that the flexbox is a complex topic for a lot of beginners, but I really hope you understood everything, and that is all you need to know about the flexbox in CSS. Let's take a look at the grid in CSS. To create a grid, we'll first of all create some divs in HTML. The first div is the parent element and has the class of container, and every other div will have a class of item.1, item.2, item.3, item.4, item.5, and item.6. So we basically have 6 items inside of one container. Now we create a selector for our container, and we create a selector for every single item and give every single item a background color. So as you can see, we now have 6 containers. Every container has the same width and the same height, and everyone has a different background color. Now, to use a grid, we can use display grid. And as you can see, nothing is going to change. And the reason is that for a grid, we need some additional setup. We need to define the amount and the width of the columns, and we need to define the amount and the height of the rows. And in order to do so, we can use grid template columns and grid template rows. So by using grid template columns, we define the amount of rows we'll have. So you can either use pixels or fractions. So let's start by using pixels. So let's say we have 2 columns, for example. The first column has a width of 200 pixels, for example, and the second one has a width of 200 pixels, for example. And as you can see, we already have our columns right now. So 2 columns. This is the first column, 200 pixels, and this is the second column, 200 pixels. Now let's do the same for our rows by using grid template rows. And let's say the first row has a height of 400 pixels and the second one has a height of 300 pixels, for example. And as you can see, we now have a gap between our rows. So first row 400 pixels, second row 300 pixels, and since we have a third row here, we should probably create a third one, 200 pixels. So now we have enough space for our 6 items. If I'm going to remove the width and the height for each box and save the document, you can see that each of these items now takes up all of the available space of the columns and the rows, so basically of the grid. And now it's really good to visualize. We have 2 columns. Each of these columns has a width of 200 pixels, and we have 3 rows. The first row has a height of 400 pixels, the second row has a height of 300 pixels, and the third row has a height of 200 pixels. Instead of pixels, we could also use fractions though. And fractions basically just means you have a certain amount of space inside of this container. We could, for example, say that we want to have a width of 100% of the viewport width, and we can have a height of 100% of the viewport height. which actually means that this is the width and this is the height. So everything is the width and everything is the height. So the entire window is width and height basically. And now we can basically say that we want to divide this available space and use that available space to basically create our grid. So we could, for example, say that we want the first column to take one fraction of the available space, while the second column, for example, should take 2 fractions of the available space. And once we save, you can basically see that the first column takes up 1 fraction and the second column takes up 2 fractions of all of the available space. So basically of the entire viewport width. So let's take a look at the grid template rows. We can do the same here. Let's say the first row should take up 1 fraction of the available space. The second row should take up 3 fractions of the available space. And the fourth row should take up probably 1 fraction of the available space. So as you can see, first row 1 fraction, second row 3 fractions, third row 1 fraction. And everything works as expected. You can also create a gap by using the gap property. So we can, for example, say that we want a gap of 10 pixels in between the items. And now it looks like that. And imagine you would have photos right here. This could be a perfect photo grid, for example. This could be a photo, this could be a photo, this could be a photo, and so on. Now, for every individual item, we could actually define how many columns and how many rows that item should take up. So basically how much space it should cover. So we could, for example, say that we want to have a third column, for example, that takes up 1 fraction. And now our grid has some available space at the bottom. So let's say I want our first item to take up the space from here to here, basically. So basically from spot 1, 2 to 3. You basically got to divide this into a regular table, if you want to say so. And then you can like really imagine what the lines look like. So this is basically point 1. This is point 2, this is point 3, and this is point 4. And if you go from top to bottom, this is point 1, this is point 2, this is point 3, and this is point 4. So you have point 1 to 4. And now you can go into the item and define for every single item how much space it should basically fill. And you can do so by defining grid columns, for example. And now we could say we want to start at position 1 for the first item. And we want to go up to position 2, 3. So we want to go from 1 to 3. And you can do so and indicate so by using the slash, for example. So let's say our second item is just fine, but now we want our third item, so the green container, basically to take up the space from, let's say, 1 to 2 to 3. So we just use grid columns again and we say 1/3 and it'll take up all of the space. So let's say we want to have item 4, so the purple one basically, to take up the space from here to here. So we can go here and now we need to define rows basically because it should take up everything from row 1, 2, 3, 4, from 2 to 4. So we go ahead and use grid rows and we say we want to go from row 2 to 4. As you can see, it's now displaying only the purple one and not the other ones anymore. And we can change that by using grid column. And we want to start at position 1, 2, 3 to 4. So we want to go from 3 to 4. And as you can see, we have our layout again. Now there would be a second option to do the same or to achieve the same. So let's just delete all of these things and we have our base layout again. So let's say we want this item to take up basically 2 columns. So basically we want to go from here, 1, 2 to the right. And we can do so by using grid columns, so the same property basically, but we can use a different syntax. We can say span 2. So you want this to span over the amount of 2 columns, if you want to say so. So we basically start here and span for 1 and span for 2. And once we save, we have the same result. And obviously the same also works for rows. So let's just say we want the green one to take up 2 rows, for example. And we can do so by going to the green one and say grid row span. We are going from 0, 1, 2. So we want to span over 2 rows again. And once we save, we basically have the expected result. And this is all you need to know about creating grids in HTML and CSS. Let's understand media queries in CSS. First of all, we create a div with the class of container. Let's say that div has a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, as well as a background color of yellow. Now we can change properties of this container, for example, by using a media query. You can create a media query by using add media. And after that add media attribute, you can define several properties if you want to. For example, we can define a min width, a max width, a min height, and a max height. So let's say we want to define a max width of 700 pixels. Now we use opening and closing brackets. And now inside of these brackets, we can, for example, define styles for the container that only apply when the width is 700 pixels or below. So let's say for our container, we want to have a background color of, for example, aqua when the width is below 700 pixels. So let's test that by making our window a little bit smaller. And as you can see, we get below 700 pixels, our container is basically turning blue. And once we make our screen larger again, it will get yellow again once our screen has a width of above 700 pixels. Obviously, we could also do the same, but say that we want to use the min width, for example. By default, if we have a width of above 700 pixels, our container has a color of blue, and otherwise it has a color of yellow. Obviously, you could change pretty much all of the properties. We could also say that we want to change the width to 200 pixels, for example, once we have a certain width. And now our container is a little bit bigger. And once the screen gets below 700 pixels, it will get smaller and yellow again. Besides min width, min height, and max height, you can also define media queries that consider orientation like portrait or landscape. And you can do so by using the and keyword and using an opening and closing bracket. And inside of these brackets, you can say, for example, orientation, and you can see you can either choose landscape or portrait. Let's say we want to use the portrait orientation. And once we save, as you can see, nothing is going to change. And we can also use landscape. And as you see, now we don't have that container anymore because those styles only apply to portrait, and we are not in the portrait landscape right now because we are in the landscape. So let's change that back to portrait so we see the difference. And now we could also add a third argument if we want to do so by defining a type of either screen, print, speech, or all. We can, for example, say add media screen and min width 700 pixels and orientation portrait. And if I save, nothing is going to change because we are obviously using a screen right now. And screen basically just means if you're using any form of a screen, it could be the screen of a mobile phone, it could be the screen of a PC, it could be the screen of a laptop. So just any screen, and those styles will apply. We could also say that we want to use print, for example, and then you will only see those styles when printing, basically. You can also say speech, which would be for screen readers and might be useful if you have like text to read out. And you can also use all, which is basically just the default value. But yeah, most of the time you can just leave those values. And the only really important value is basically the min width, max width, min height, and max height. In some cases, you want to do some things maybe based on the orientation, so that might be useful. But that is basically all you need to know about media queries in CSS. Let's understand pseudo classes, starting with hover. In order to show you hover, let's create a div inside of HTML with the class of container. Now that we have that class, we are going into CSS. We are going to target our container. We'll give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of yellow, for example. To use the hover pseudo class, we are again going to target our container, but this time followed by a colon and the hover pseudo class. And by using this syntax, you're going to use the hover pseudo class. Now again, opening and closing brackets, and inside of this container, we can basically define the things that should change once we hover over the element. So in our case, let's say once we hover over the element, we want to have a different background color of maybe aqua. We are going to save our document. We are going to hover over the yellow element. And as you can see, we now have an aqua background. We could obviously also change the width, for example, once we hover to 150 pixels and the height to 150 pixels, for example. Like this. And now once we hover, the height and the width should also change. And as you can see, it does. So hover defines what is going to happen once you hover over an element. The next pseudo class works for links, for example. So let's create a link to take a look at it. Let's say we have a link to Google, for example, and we're going to target the link by using the A tag, and now we can add the active pseudo class by using :active. So the syntax is pretty similar to the hover pseudo class. The only difference is that you have active instead of hover right here. Now we use opening and closing brackets once again, and we can say that we want to have a background color of brown, for example, once our link becomes active. And you'll see what active means once I click the link. And now I'm going to click it. You can see the background color is getting brown. And once I release the click, the background color turns to white again. So active basically means what is going to happen once the element is active. So once the link is clicked, for example. So let's take a look at focus next. But before, we can remove this code. And we'll remove this code inside of HTML as well. And in order to really understand focus, we are going to add an input field of type text, for example. Now we'll target this input field by using the input selector, and we'll add the focus pseudo class by using :focus. And the focus pseudo class defines what is going to happen once the element becomes focused. Once I click inside of this input element, the input element becomes focused. And right now you can see once the input element becomes focused, we have an outline around the input element. So let's say we want to remove that outline, for example, because that is something you really want to do pretty often. So let's say we have an outline of none once the user clicks inside of the input field. So let's click inside of the input field, and now we don't have an outline anymore. So let's say we also want to have a background color of probably blue, which would look terrible, but to visualize it, I think this works pretty good. And now we are going to click into the input field and we have a blue background. So this is how focused works. Let's take a look at the visited pseudo class. And in order to do so, we are going to create an anchor tag again, and that anchor tag is going to go to Google, for example. So we need the link to Google. We are going to get the link to Google by going to Google ourselves. Then we are going to copy that link. Basically, we are going to put it into the href. We are going to use target equals _blank to open it in a new tab. And now we'll target our anchor tag by using a:visited. And we'll define a background color once we visited the link. So we'll say our background color once the link is basically visited is going to be brown. And if the link has not been visited yet, our background color is going to be white. And once we save, we basically see that we already visited that link, so the background color is going to be blue. So let me copy my YouTube link in here, and as you can see, we didn't visit YouTube yet, so not my channel at least. So the background color of Google, which is actually my YouTube link, so we can actually change that to YouTube, for example. And once I click on this link, we'll land on my YouTube page, and the link will have a background color of brown. So let's test that. We're going to click the link. We're going to land. My internet is terrible right now, so yeah, that might take forever, but you can see we actually loaded my YouTube page, and now our link has a background color of brown right now. So this is actually also working. So visited just defines how something should look after you visited it, basically. So let's close my channel page after you subscribed. So to understand first child, we are going into our HTML file, we're going to create a div, and inside of this div, we are going to create 2 paragraphs. Each of these paragraphs has some placeholder text of 5 words, for example, and then we're going to take this div, copy this div a second time, and this time we'll have an h1 at the top, for example, or let's say an h2. We'll have some placeholder text as well, and we'll have a second h2 at the bottom, for example. So this is the first div, and this is the second div. And let's give this div a class of cont1, and the second div a class of cont2. And let's style those containers just to have a visualization to differentiate them. So that is cont1. Let's copy that. Let's say cont2 has a background color of whatever, maybe some green. And now we have those 2 containers, basically. So the first container basically has 2 paragraphs. The second container has 2 h2 elements and 2 paragraphs. So let's target the paragraphs inside. And we can do so by using p:, followed by first child, for example. And I think it's easier to understand once you just see the difference. So we're going to give the first child of the p tag basically a background color of, let's say, green, for example. So now our first p element inside of our first container has a background color of green. So why is that? The reason for this is that when it comes to having p tag siblings, colon first child will always select the first child of something. And since the p tag is the first child of this div, first child will basically select this p tag and give it a background color of green. If you go into this div, for example, the first child is the h2 tag and not the p tag. Therefore, this p tag and this p tag will not get a background color of green, for example. So colon first child always targets the first child, in our case the first p tag, that is the first child of something, and give that one the defined styles. So let's say we want to have the last p tag, for example. So let's use p colon last child, and let's give that one a font size, for example, of 10. So that one is going to be pretty small now. And as you can see, the last child inside of the div right here will have a font size of 10. So if we would remove this h2 element, for example, our last p tag should also have a pretty small font size once we save. And as you can see, I saved, and now our last p tag inside of this container has also a pretty small font size, because that is the last child inside of the container as well now. Another option is to use nth child, and in order to do so, we are going to duplicate our paragraph inside our first container a couple of times. And now let's use p colon nth child. And now we can use opening and closing brackets, but here we also need some brackets, and inside of these brackets we can define how many children we want to select. So I'm going to remove that first of all to see the difference. And now we can say we want to use the defined styles on every second child, for example. So let's use 2n, and that is basically a syntax to define the amount of childs we want to target. 2n basically means use every second child. And now let's give that child a background color of blue, for example. And as you can see, every second p tag, every second child that is a p tag basically, will have a background color of blue. We could also say let's do that for every third child, and we're going to save. And as you can see, we did the same for every third child. We could also do it for every child. Now every p tag has a background color of blue, and we can also use even. And now we will have every second child. And instead of even, we could also use odd to select the odd numbers. So let's delete that, and let's take a look at disabled, required, and checked. First of all, to use the checked pseudo class, we need to use a checkbox. So we're going to create an input of type checkbox, and let's just save the document. Now we just have this input, and let's say once our input is basically checked, we want to have a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. So that should be a pretty big difference. Now I'm going to check it, and as you can see, we have a pretty big input. Next, let's take a look at disabled. So let's create an input field that is disabled, so input of type text, for example, and let's add the disabled attribute. Now we have a disabled input field, and let's say once our input is disabled, we add a background color of black, for example. And as you can see, now our disabled input field has a background color of black. Next, we can also target an input field that has the required attribute, for example. So let's add an input field of type text again, and let's add the required attribute again to this input field. And now we can also target this input field of type required, and we can say we want to have a background color of bisque, for example, for that required field. And as you can see, we now have a background color of bisque for the input field with the attribute of required. And that is all you need to know about pseudo classes in CSS. Let's learn the pseudo elements before and after. In order to do so, we are first going to create a short paragraph of 5 words. We're going to save the website, and pseudo elements are pretty straightforward. Before allows you to add content before an element, and after allows you to add content after an element. So let me show you. Let's say we want to target this paragraph. We're going to use 2 colons when using pseudo elements, and now we can add the before property, for example. Instead of this pseudo element, we can now use the content property to define a content. So we could, for example, say that this is some additional text, for example. And once we save, we have this is some additional text right before that class. Now we can also define a display of block to turn this before element into a block element. And as you can see, now the second paragraph goes right below the first paragraph. Obviously, we can also just define normal properties like we could do for every other element, like a background color of brown and so on. So we can do some normal styling to pseudo elements as well. Now we can also use p : after to define an element afterwards, and we can again say content should be this is after the text. And now we are going to save our file, and you can see this is after the text pop up right after our placeholder text. So let's also give that one a display of blocks so we can visualize this a little bit better. And now we have this is after the text right after our normal text. Obviously you can again use something like background color if we wanted to, and save the document, and now we have a background color as well. And this is all you need to know about pseudo elements in CSS. Let's understand transform in CSS. In order to do so, let's first of all create a div with the class of container. Now let's style this container by targeting the container class and giving it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Let's give it a background color of yellow once again, and we're going to save the document, and we'll have this yellow container at the top of our page. So let's get that one into the center of our page by giving our body a display of flex, justify items of center, and align items of center, so we see everything a little bit better. And this one will have a height of 100 viewport height. So now this yellow box is in the center, and transform has a lot of different properties if you want to say so. So we can use transform by just typing transform, and now we have some different options like translate, scale, rotate, skew, or a combination of all of these options. So let's start by using translate. And there exists translate, translate X, translate Y, and translate Z. But you usually only use translate X or Y, or the shorthand property, which is translate. So let's start by using translate X. And as the name implies, you can translate the content on the X axis. So let's use translate X by 100 pixels, for example. And as you can see, our content moved a little bit to the right. So we could also say, let's go 100 pixels to the left. So 100 pixels to the left on the x-axis. And the same obviously also works for translate y. So we could say go 200 pixels along the y-axis, or we could go in the opposite direction and go 200 pixels or minus 200 pixels along the y-axis. The shorthand property is obviously just translate instead of translate x and y. So we could say go 300 pixels along the x-axis and go 200 pixels along the y-axis. And now we have this result basically. The next property is the scale property, which is pretty self-explanatory. You have a scale factor, normal is just 1. If you are bigger than 1, you are basically scaling up. So 1.5 makes the element a little bit bigger, and 0.5 makes the element a little bit smaller, for example. Rotate works pretty much the same. You just rotate an element. You can define degrees, for example. So you can, for example, say, let's rotate the element by 180, or let's make 45 degrees, because that would basically be visual at least. You could at least see the difference, I'd say. And if we are going to rotate by 90 degrees, you should not see a difference, but it's rotated by 90 degrees now. Next option is skew. So we can basically tilt our content, if you want to say so, by using skew, and we can again use degrees for that option. So we can, for example, say let's skew our content along the x-axis again, if we want to, by 45 degrees. And as you can see, we skewed our content along the x-axis by 45 degrees. So obviously the same works for the y-axis again. And now our content is skewed along the y-axis. So the shorthand property is basically skew, where you can define a value for x, 40 degrees for example, and a value for y, 30 degrees for example. And as you can see, now our element is basically skewed. But that is something I've rarely ever seen, so most people don't use skew, but if you want to use that, you can. Obviously, you can also combine all of these properties, so you can, for example, say I want to translate 100 pixels into the x direction, 200 pixels into the y direction, then I want to scale by a scale factor of 1.5, and I want to rotate by maybe 45 degrees. And as you can see, we now have a combination of all of those transform properties. You can also change the transform origin, and that is also the reason why I wanted to have the element in the center of the page, because now it's a lot easier to show you the difference. So let's just use scale 1 for now, because that will not change anything, and I want to change the transform origin by using transform minus origin. And now I can set the origin to the top, to the left, to the bottom, or to the right. And I can also use a combination like top or left, for example. And this will basically just change the center, so the origin from where we apply those transformations. So now our origin is the top left. So if we are going to scale, we're going to start at the top left because that is our anchor point, if you want to say so. And especially if you have some experience with video editing, you know what the anchor point is. So this is basically the anchor point. So now we are going to start to scale our image from the top left. And now if I'm going to increase the size, for example, let's take a look at this element. I'm going to save the document. And as you can see, we started to scale our element from the top left, and it's basically going down here. So it's basically going to start to scale from here into this direction. And if I'm going to use a scale factor of 3, you should see it even better. So the transform origin might something that might really be useful, or you might want to do under some circumstances. Obviously also if you want to rotate around the top left, for example, that would make a lot of sense. You could now, for example, say let's rotate by 180 degrees, for example, or 170, it doesn't really matter. And now you basically rotate around this anchor point. And that might also be really useful if you start to animate things. And that is all you need to know about transform in CSS. Let's understand transitions in CSS. First of all, we create a container inside of HTML with the class of container. Now let's add a hover effect to that container by targeting the container and giving it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of yellow. Now let's say once we hover over the container, we want to change the background color to brown, for example. And now you can see we are hovering over the container, and the container or the background color basically turns brown. But let's say we want to have a transition from yellow to brown, because right now this is really an abrupt change when we are hovering over the yellow container. So let's add a transition property, and there are different properties to define different properties of a transition. And the first one is the transition property we want to animate. And let's say in our case, we want to animate our background color. We could either say all, which would obviously animate all properties, or we can select a specific one like the background color, for example. Now let's add a transition duration. So basically, how long does it take for the transition to complete? And in our case, we can, for example, say 0.5 seconds. And as you can see, if we are hovering over our yellow container, we already have a change of the background color within 0.5 seconds. So now there are also different transition timing functions. And to really understand transition timing functions, I have this graph for you. There exists, for example, an ease timing function, an ease in timing function, ease out timing function, ease in out timing function, or a linear timing function. So let's take a look at a timing function, for example, by using transition timing function. And now we can obviously already see some different cubic Bezier timing functions. And now you also have ease in out, and ease out, and linear as well. And obviously linear just means the animation will play at a constant speed. If you have ease in, for example, right here, you are basically starting slow and then you're getting faster. If you have ease out, you're starting pretty fast and you're getting slower towards the end of the animation. The ease timing function basically starts pretty slow, gets a lot faster, and ends pretty slow again. So we could, for example, say let's use ease, the normal ease timing function. So basically this one. Or we can also use ease in, out. Doesn't really matter for demonstration purposes. And let's save that and go back to our animation. We're going to hover over it, and now we have a different timing function. You can also add a transition delay, for example, which just delays the animation. So we can, for example, say let's wait 1 second, and after 1 second the animation will play. So let's hover over it, it'll take a second, and now the animation will play. And now there also exists a shorthand property for all of those properties, which is basically just the transition property. For the first argument, we can define the property we want to animate, which is the background color in our case, but we could also say all. So let's use all to show you that that works as well. Now the second argument is the transition duration. Let's say we want to have 1 second this time. Now we can use a timing function. Let's use ease in and out again, and let's use a transition delay of 2 seconds, for example. We're going to delete those properties to see that this really works, and now we'll save our file and we'll hover over our yellow container once it appears. So now our yellow container appears, 2 seconds, and the animation will play. And this is all you need to know about transitions in CSS. Let's take a look at position relative, absolute, and fixed. In order to understand that, we are first going to create a div, and inside of this div we have 2 other divs. Our first div is going to have the class container. Our second div is going to have the class subcontainer1, And our third div is going to have the class subcontainer2. So we basically have 3 divs right now. Let's give them a background inside of CSS. First of all, we target our normal container and give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels and a background color of aquamarine, for example. Now we target our subcontainer1. We'll give that one a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels and a background color of yellow, for example. We copy that and we'll paste it and do the same for subcontainer2, but we'll change the color a little bit to probably around blue. Now, as you can see, we basically have 2 containers inside of this big container. So first of all, let's understand position relative. Let's go ahead and set position to relative by using the relative property. As you can see, nothing changed at this point. To really change something, we can use top, left, right, and bottom properties. And the top property, the left property, the right property, and the bottom property always defines the gap, so basically the space you want to create from that position. So if we say top 500 pixels, for example, we say that we are starting from the top and we push our content 500 pixels away from the top. That is what we're basically saying by doing so. And as you can see, once I save, we're pushing our content 500 pixels away from the top. And we could obviously also say, let's push our content 100 pixels away from the left. So we go into this direction. And as you can see, we pushed our content 500 pixels away from the top and 100 pixels away from the left. So what does position relative exactly means? Position relative means that the content will be moved relative to its original position. Our original box was right here, and we said, okay, this is the original position. Now we'll move it 500 pixels away from our original position down here and 100 pixels from the left from the original position. So this basically means position relative always moves the content away from the original position, so basically relative to the original position. Let's replace 500 pixels with 100 pixels, for example, to have a better visualization. Now we could, for example, say that I want to move my second container relative to its original position as well. So we could again say position is equal to relative, and now we want to move it 100 pixels away from the top, for example. And this is basically the result. What if we change position to absolute though? As you can see, now we are right here. So what is the difference between relative and absolute? Absolute always takes the next parent element that has position relative, which is in our case the container. So if we go in here, we have this container that has position relative right now, as you can see right here. And our subcontainer2 has position of absolute. So the parent element, the next parent element that has position of relative is basically the container. So we say we move our position, basically if you want to say it like that, relative to the original container that has position relative. So if you think about that, we are basically going to have our subcontainer. Our subcontainer2 is going to move relative to the position of our container that has position relative, which is the entire box. So we're going to start at the top right here. And now we are saying go 100 pixels down from the parent element, so basically our container. And now if we would say go to the left for 100 pixels, for example, we go to the left relative to our parent element for 100 pixels. So if we're basically setting this to 0 and this to 0, we will exactly start at the top left, because that is where our parent element is basically starting. So if we would set this one to position absolute and say go down 100 pixels, the same would actually happen, because the subcontainer is also the child of our regular container. So we are basically saying again, we are moving our subcontainer 1 relative to the parent element basically, so our container. So position relative always means move the element relative to its original position, while position absolute basically means move the element relative to its parent element. Now you would also have the option to use position fixed. So we're going to do that for one of our subcontainers by using position fixed. So now we can, for example, say let's start at the right by using right 0. So we have a gap to the right of 0. And let's start from the top And let's also use 0 for the top, so we are going to start at the top. And as you can see, position fixed basically always refers to the position on the screen. So no matter what I do with the screen, it's always going to stay at the top right, even if I would like scroll down, for example. So imagine I would probably have another container, another div of container, so I could scroll. And as you can see, even if I scroll, let's make some more. Even if I scroll, the yellow box will always stay on the top right of the screen. So position fixed basically means just place the element on a fixed position on the screen and it will not move from that position, whatever you do. And that is all you need to know about position relative, absolute, and fixed. Let's learn about shadows in CSS. First of all, we'll create a div in order to do so and a paragraph with 5 words of text. We're going to save the document and we're going to go into our style.css file. We give our div a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels and a background color of brown, for example. We're going to save the document and now we have this div and we have this paragraph. Let's say we want to have a shadow for this div, for example, and we can do so by using the box minus shadow property. And the box minus shadow property takes 4 arguments, if you want to say so. The first one is the x offset, so x offset. Then we have the y offset. Then we have the blur. And the last one is the color, basically. Let's say we want to have an x offset of probably 20 pixels. Like this. Let's say we want to have a y offset of probably 10 pixels. Like this. Let's say we don't want to have a blur at all. And a color of black, for example. And as you can see, we have this shadow right now. And to show you that this really works, let's use a y offset of 20 pixels, which will shift our shadow to the bottom on the y-axis. And now we can add a blur, for example, of, 20 pixels. Now we have a blurred shadow, as you can see. And we can also change the color, if you want to say so, to red, for example. And now we have a red shadow. And you can also use RGB instead of regular color names, of course. Or you could use RGBA if you want to do so. So let's try to give our P tag a shadow as well, so our text basically. And if we just copy our box shadow to our paragraph and save, you can see that this looks pretty weird and this is probably not what we are looking for. So there's an alternative for text basically, that is the text shadow, and the properties are exactly the same. X offset, Y offset, blur, and color. So let's use an offset of 5 pixels on the x-axis, 5 pixels on the y-axis, a blur of probably, let's say, 10 pixels, and a color of black to make it easy. And as you can see, now we have a shadow for our text. And text shadow and box shadow pretty much work exactly the same. It's just important that you use basically text shadow for text and box shadow for pretty much everything else. And that is all you need to know about shadows in CSS. Let's understand animations in CSS. First of all, let's create a div that we can animate. And now let's give that div a width and a height of 100 pixels. And let's give it a background color of yellow, for example. Now we are going to save that and now let's animate that div. We can animate by using the add keyframes property. And then we have to give it an identifier that is basically the name of the animation. And we can, for example, say that we want to have the name move, for example. Now there are several options to really animate something, and the first one would be to use from, then opening and closing brackets, and then the second keyword would be to and opening and closing brackets. And inside of the from clause you define the initial state, and in the to clause you define the end state of the animation. So we could, for example, say that we want to use transform, translate, which basically just moves the element into a certain direction. Let's use translate x and say we want to start at translate x 0 pixels. So we start from the initial position because we're not translating at all. And then we are going to translate x, for example, 200 pixels. So we move our element 200 pixels to the right. And obviously we need to use the transform property. So like this, it should basically work. Now we need to define the transition property for our div element. And there are several different properties to do so. And the first one is the animation name, since we need to define which animation we want to use. And our animation name is move, because this is the name we gave to our animation. So let's give our animation name the name move, or define the animation name move right here for animation minus name. The second thing we need to do is define an animation duration. And we can do so by using animation minus duration. And let's say we want to have an animation of around 4 seconds. And as you can see, it's already animated. It goes from left to right, so it basically does exactly what we defined. There's also an option to define an animation iteration count. Right now you saw the animation basically just played one time, but that was actually it. But maybe we want the animation to play maybe forever, for example. And we can do so by using animation iteration count. So let's do animation iteration count, and the only option you might ever want to use is probably infinite. So you can use infinite right here, and as you can see, now our animation will repeat forever basically. The next property that might be useful is the animation direction. And you can, for example, choose normal, which is just a default value, so that might not be something that you want to type out. But you can also do reverse or alternate reverse, for example. So you could, for example, do reverse, and now the animation will play from the end to the start, basically. And alternate reverse basically just means you first play the animation in the normal direction, and then you reverse the animation. So that would actually look like this. You can also define an animation timing function, for example, and let's say we want to have an ease in out, for example, and we can do so by choosing it from here. You can also use ease in, ease out, so that is pretty similar to transitions basically. So let's choose ease in out. So the next property that might be useful is the animation delay, which just defines, as the name already implies, a delay. So you can, for example, say I want to do an animation, but I want to have a delay of 3 seconds, for example. And let's remove some of those properties because we really don't need them right now. And as you can see now, we're waiting for 3 seconds, and after 3 seconds the animation is basically playing. So that is the delay. And now let's take a look at the last property, which is the animation fill mode. And if you set the animation fill mode to forward, this basically means take the animation and you're going to stop the animation at the last frame. And you will see the difference once I save this file and the animation is going to play. So as you can see, animation is playing, normal playing, but now the animation, so the box in our case, stops at the last frame, and now the box will stay here. So if you want to start from here, for example, once the user loads the page, and then you want to animate your box, for example, right here, and then you'll go to the bottom, whatever you want to do, the box will basically stop at the end. So in this case, it will be the bottom, and the user will see the box for the rest of the time at the bottom. There's also the option backward. And this is something that is really useful if your initial state is basically different from the state your box is usually in. So our usual box is basically right here, but our initial state for the animation is right here, if you want to say so. And if we want to use that initial state or display that initial state before the animation basically starts to play, we'll have to use backwards. So let me remove this animation fill mode for now. And as you can see, we're starting at the left. Our animation starts here though, and once the delay is over, our cube jumps to the start of the animation and then goes to the right. Now if we would add our animation fill mode to backwards again, it will stay here at the start of the animation during our animation delay time, and then it will move. And now you can also say I want to use both, so I want to use backwards and forward. So we're going to start at the start of our animation, and we're going to stop at the last keyframe of our animation. I know some of this stuff might be really confusing, and again, you might not really use this animation fill method or fill mode too often, but if you want to use it, you know how it works now. There's also a shorthand property, and I really recommend everyone to just use the shorthand property because that is a lot faster and also a lot more clear in my opinion. So you're just going to type animation, and Visual Studio Code already indicates the properties that you have to fill in. So we can use a name, move for example. We can set a duration of 5 seconds for example. We could say we want an ease in out for example, delay of 0 seconds, so you can just leave that away, and we want an iteration count of infinite, and that is something you will probably do a lot of the times. And direction and fill mode, you'll probably never use that or almost never, so we can just delete that Because I mean, if you wanted to reverse an animation, why wouldn't you just type out the reversed order from the beginning? Like, doesn't really make too much sense to me, but if you want to use it, use it. And now we basically have this animation here, and it will loop forever. And this is something that you might use a lot of the times if you are working with animations. Now there's also a different option. We only used from and to right now, but we could do the same by using 0% and 100%, for example. And now we have an animation that works exactly the same, but we use 0% and 100%. But we could also say, okay, this is like 25%. And if you want to create animations with a lot of keyframes, you should definitely use percentages. So now we could also say 50%, we want to transform, we want to translate. Now we do not just want to translate X, we also want to translate Y. So we translate to 200 pixels on the x-axis and let's say to 200 pixels on the y-axis. So let's save that. We're going to the right, we're going to the bottom, and now we're going back to the top. Let's say we're going to 75% and we want to have a translation to the left again. So we're just going to use this translate statement. We remove the first one and we obviously need to add transform. And we need to add translate 0 to the x-axis. So we're going to the left now. As you can see, we're going to the right, to the bottom, to the left, and now we're going back up to the top. And maybe it makes more sense to start at 0 right here, because that would make the animation look a little bit better. And as you can see, that is how you can animate something inside of CSS with just a few properties. Let me introduce you to filters in CSS. First of all, to apply a filter, let's use an image that we can use to apply filters on. And we take our car.jpg file, and now we will give our image a class, or we don't even need a class. We're going to style our image by using the image tag. We're going to use a width of maybe 500 pixels. We're going to save the file, and now we have this car basically. So let's apply some filters, and you can apply a filter by using the filter property inside of CSS. And if you just type out the filter property followed by a colon, Visual Studio Code should already suggest you a couple of filters. And one of the filters will basically be blur. You can define a blur amount inside of the blur property of 10 pixels, for example. And as you can see, we now have a blur. Instead of the blur, let's add the brightness, for example. So let's again write filter, brightness, and let's maybe say we want to have a brightness of 1, which is the base value, so the default value. We can also say we want to have 1.3, which would be a little bit brighter, 2 would be a lot brighter, and if we go to 0.5, for example, or 4, it would be a little bit darker. Now we can also increase the contrast by using the contrast property and say, yeah, let's have a contrast of 1, which is default, 2, it's a little bit more, and 0.3, it's a lot less. The grayscale basically just adds a grayscale, if you want to say so. Let's add 1 right here. Let's add 0.3. So this basically just turns your image into a gray scaled image, if you want to say so. You can also use drop shadow by using the filter property. So this is a little similar to the box shadow, if you want to say so. So we could also use an X offset 10 pixels, Y offset 10 pixels, the blur amount 10 pixels, for example, or let's make a stronger blur by 20 pixels by using 20 pixels, and let's use black as the color. And as you can see, we now have our drop shadow right here. And this is basically the X value, that's the Y value, that's the blur, and that's the color. And that is just how you could add a drop shadow by using the filter property. And this is all you need to know about filters in CSS. Let's understand specificity in CSS. And in order to do so, we'll first create a div, and we'll give our div a class of container class, and we give it an ID of container ID. So we have a container class and container ID now. So let me use container class to give our div a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of yellow. And once we save our document, we have our styles applied to our div container. So what if I would use our ID to style the exact same element? So let me do that. Let me use hashtag container minus ID, and let's say I want to have a background color of aqua, for example, but now our div has the background color of aqua. So the container ID is basically overwritten the container class. So that means if you have a class and an ID, the ID seems to be more important than the class, and it does not just seem to be a matter of the order, because if I put our container class right after the container ID, the container ID will still override the container class. So it seems like targeting an element by ID seems to be stronger than targeting an element by class. And that is something that you just have to remember. An ID is always stronger than a class. But there's more to it. What if I would just use the div element, for example, and say I want to have a background color of bisque, for example. And as you can see, I'm saving the file and nothing seems to happen. So a normal element seems to be weaker than an ID, for example. So let me delete the ID and see what is going to happen. Once I delete the ID, you can see we now have our yellow class. So a class seems to be stronger than a regular element as well. So an element seems to be weaker than a class when it comes to specificity, and it seems to be weaker than an ID. So let me take the width and the height to the div so that we can see it. And once I delete the container class property, or the selector basically, and save the document, now we can see bisque right here. So now our element selector seems to work. So an element selector works when you only target that element by using an element selector. If you have a class selector, the class selector has priority over the element selector. And if you have an ID selector, for example, like so, the ID selector has priority over class selector and over the element selector. And now there's one thing that has even more priority than the ID selector, and that is inline styles. And you can obviously define an inline style by using style. And let's say we want to have a background color of, for example, let's take blue violet. And once we save, our container now has the color blue violet. So inline styles even override ID selectors. But usually you don't really want to use inline styles, so that is something that is not really that important because you want to avoid them anyways. In addition to that, you could also use the important keyword right here and say, okay, that one is really important, please override every other selector, and important has the highest priority. So if you use important, this will basically override anything. But again, I want to mention that this lesson, to a lot of people, this one is like really important, but to me, I think it's kind of useless. You never want to use important anyways. You should write your code in a way that does not even force you to use important in the first place. In the second place, I feel like you should only target your files in CSS by using a single class or ID. You should not use class and IDs separately to target the same element. So even that doesn't really matter. And I would not really suggest to use element selectors at all anyway. So if you have an ID and you want to target a specific element, use the ID. If you want to target multiple elements, use the classes of these elements. Element has a lower specificity, then you have class, ID, inline styles, and important overrides everything. And that's all you need to know about specificity in CSS. Let's understand how to use different fonts in CSS. First of all, we'll create a p tag inside of HTML, so we'll see the difference later on. So we have this font right here. And now we can add a different font by going to Google Fonts, for example, and searching for a different font right there. So we can browse fonts right here by clicking on the link. Once the website is loaded, we can basically scroll through thousands of fonts and choose a font that we want to use. So we could, for example, use StoryScript if we want to do so. And now on the website, we can press the Get Font button. And right here, you can, for example, click the Get Embedded Code button. And right here, you see two options. You can either use the link to import the font, or you can use an import statement to import the font. And all you have to do is basically copy the code right here. If you copy the link, you're going into your head in the HTML file, and you just copy your links in there. And now you can use the font by copying the font family line, for example, going into your CSS file. Now we can, for example, target the paragraph. We go back to our page to see the difference. And now we paste the font family, StoryScript, sans serif in there. And we'll save our file and you will see a difference. And now, as you can see, we have a different font right here. Now, obviously, the link is just the first option and there's a second option, but I usually prefer the link option. But you can obviously also like delete this again. Now we have our base font again. And now we try to use the import method. So we are going to go to the add import method right here and we'll copy this link. And as you can see, we need to import this one in a style sheet. So we are going into our style CSS, which we are already in basically. We're going to paste this URL. And now again, we can copy the font family, StoryScript, sans serif. We're going to paste that into the brackets of our paragraph. We'll save our website. And again, we have the same outcome. So we basically have our font once again. This time we use the import method. I would highly recommend you to use the link method though, because that one is better when it comes to performance and loads the font a little bit faster, because obviously the head gets executed prior to the CSS file. So head gets executed, you load the font, and you immediately have the font. And the other option is obviously you load the font once you load the CSS file, and that might take a little longer. So definitely recommended to use the link inside of the head when importing fonts in CSS. And that's all you need to know about fonts in CSS. So I've defined an H1, an H2 and an H3 inside of this HTML document. And now let's use variables to create a style for those headings. To define a variable, we have to use colon, root, followed by opening and closing brackets. And inside of this root element, we can now define our variables. So let's say, for example, we want to have a variable dash dash Goku, for example. So you use a dash dash followed by the name of the variable that you want to use, followed by the value for this variable. And then in our case, let's say the variable has the value black, for example. Now let's also create the variable dash dash Vegeta, for example, which will have a value of blue, for example. And obviously you can also use useful names like dash dash primary, for example, or primary color, which could be yellow, for example. So now we have three variables right here. To use those variables, we can now say h1, for example, should have a color. So we define a color property. And now to use a variable, we use the var keyword, followed by opening and closing brackets. And as you can see, we can now select the variable we want to use right inside of those brackets by using dash dash and the name of the variable. In our case, let's use dash dash Goku. And maybe Goku doesn't make too much sense because Goku is black as well. So let's use Vegeta probably. That wasn't probably the smartest move. But we need a different color. And as you can see, now we have a blue text right here for Vegeta. And we can also use dash dash primary color right here. So now we get this effect. So as you can see, by using variables, you can start to define a lot of styles. You can also say dash dash border radius, for example, and you could say your border radius should be 20 pixels, for example. And now you would have a variable that defines the border radius for your document. So every time you want to use the variable, you're just going to use var followed by the variable name. And if you want to change the border radius for the entire document, you don't have to go into every single element, for example, h1, h2, and change the radius, but you can just go to this one spot and say, okay, the entire document should now have a border radius of 10 pixels, for example. Or we want to use a primary color that is probably not yellow, but maybe red, for example. And as you can see, or orange, and now we have this orange text right here. Let me introduce you to object-oriented CSS. And in order to do so, we will first of all create a div. And in my opinion, object-oriented CSS is the most efficient way to write CSS code. And therefore, I really recommend everyone to use object-oriented CSS when it comes to writing CSS code. And object-oriented CSS just means that you separate structure and skin. So let me give you an example. Let's say we have the class of box, and that box has a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. And that dot box notation is basically the structure of an element because it defines the structure, so height and width of an element. In our case, of a box. Now we could create a second structure, for example, of circle, and now we can again use a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels and a border radius of 50%, for example. So we get a circle. And now that is again the structure because it defines the structure of a circle. So what if we want to use different colors, for example? We could, for example, create one class for dot yellow, if we want to say so, and that one will have a background color of yellow. Now we could create a second class for dot green, and that class will have a background color of green, for example. Now we're going to save our file, and if we want to create to this, for example, let's say our first div should have a class of box. Now we have a box, but we can't see anything because we don't have a color. So let's say we want to use yellow as the color, and we're going to save our file, and now we have a yellow box. And if I want to have a yellow circle now, for example, instead of a box, I can just replace box with circle. And as you can see, now I have a yellow circle. I can go ahead and for a second class, I can, for example, say I want to have a box, and a box should be green. And now I have a green box. I could also get a green circle though if I wanted to get so by just changing that one class. And as you can see, now if I want to have a box, I just have to change from circle to box. And if I want to have a different color, I just have to change the color. Otherwise, if I wanted to have one box here and then another box here, I would need two classes. But imagine I would like want to have 10 circles and every circle has a different color. Now I would obviously have to copy this box 10 times basically and give every single box a different background color like this. So box 1 would have background color green, box 2 maybe blue. I mean, you get the idea. It's not like I have to type all of this out. But in our case, we just need those 4 classes, and I can say, okay, now here I probably have yellow again. Here I could, for example, have blue. Then I could have aqua, for example, and so on. And I could also create like more classes. I don't just need to have a box and a circle. I could also like have a rectangle. And now I can give that one a width of, for example, 200 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, if I want to say so. And then I can go ahead and maybe I can create a rectangle. And I think you understand that, especially when having a lot of possible combinations, and when you use colors you usually have a lot of possible combinations, this style of writing CSS is very efficient. You could also like create one class for center, for example. So whenever you want to have something center, for example, you can just use that class and it would center basically an item. So if I want to have a circle center, for example, I can use center as a class right here. And now, whoops, control needs to be center. And now once I save, I have my item center basically. Now I could obviously also create a class for flex centered. And I could create one class for flex, whatever. I mean, you get the idea. You can create a lot of different classes, and each of these classes has a different purpose. And this obviously makes especially sense to basically separate structure from skin. And this is why I recommend everyone to use object-oriented CSS when writing CSS code, because it, first of all, in my opinion, looks a lot better and it makes everything a lot cleaner and easier.